Good morning, everybody. It's me again, and welcome back to the second day of the second forum on population health equity. We have a very exciting program lined up for you this morning with a keynote from Dr. Nancy Krieger, whom I'm going to ask Aisha to introduce to you in a moment. Just a reminder, after the break, we will have a panel on social mobility, housing, and neighborhood context on health, so please be sure to come back to that. This morning's session will be taped, so you can view it and other people can watch it afterwards, but it is not being live streamed. And part of the reason is because it is based on a it's not even off the press yet. It is based on a paper that Nancy has been working on, so it is still not public. And for that reason, we please ask you to refrain from taking pictures and during the presentation. And this will be a good chance for you to turn off your cell phones as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Aisha to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning. Everyone's awake. Okay, great. So I am really honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Nancy Krieger. In my first week here as a doctoral student in the Social and Behavioral Sciences Department here at T.H. Chan, where Dr. Krieger is professor of social epidemiology, several upperclassmen told me that hers was the course from which I would learn the most that semester. But they added, be prepared to be challenged in every single way, as a writer, as a reader, and as a scientist. And they were right. I remember sitting in class one day, marveling at her passion and expertise, and hoping that one day I would learn half of what she knew. I am certain that every single person in this room has been challenged, inspired, and guided by the groundbreaking contributions that Dr. Krieger has made throughout her career as an internationally recognized social epidemiologist, and with her background in biochemistry, philosophy of science, and of course, the history of public health. Since receiving her PhD in epidemiology, social epidemiology from UC Berkeley, she has been hugely influential, having been awarded the Thomson Reuters Highly Cited Researchers Award in 1994 and 2015. An honor she shares with less than 0.5% of all publishing researchers. She is director of the T.H. Chan School's Interdisciplinary Concentration on Women, Gender, and Health, and she has received numerous awards, including the 2015 American Cancer Society Clinical Research Professorship. She has also authored and edited a number of books, including the 2011 publication Epidemiology and the People's Health, Theory and Context. But she is much more than her prestigious accolades. She is an incredible advocate for making real-world links between social justice and public health, which I think is the most challenging and affirming aspect of her work. She is the professor that we students see at every single discussion and town hall on improving school climate and achieving equity in our community. Her epidemiologic research explores racism, discrimination of health, socioeconomic and racial ethnic disparities in breast cancer, and appropriate measures of social class for monitoring social inequalities. And she combines these interests with over 30 years of activism, linking issues involving social justice, science, and health. So it makes sense that in 1984, she co-founded and still chairs the Spirit of 1848 caucus of the American Public Health Association, which is concerned with links between social justice and public health. Today, we are all in for a treat because she is sharing some new research entitled Health Equity and the Erroneous Temptation of Making the Causes of Health Sum to 100%, an Eco-Social Model, which builds on a theory she has been developing since 1994. Out of respect, again, for this new science, I'd just like to remind you to please, there's no photography or filming of this presentation allowed, but there are some handouts just outside containing suggested readings related to this talk. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Krieger.
So good morning. I greatly appreciate being asked to be here with you today at the second Forum on Population Health Equity, which is an important new tradition here started by my colleague, Dr. Ichiro Kawachi. What I'm going to speak with you about this morning is a topic that's been troubling me of late, which is that in discussions of health equity and also population health and healthcare issues more generally, I see repeatedly resurfacing the erroneous temptation of summing up causes to equal 100%. Yet can the causes of population health be parsed into components that add up to 100%, for example, X% social, and therefore 100 minus X% biological, or more specifically, genetic? The question is consequential for how health professionals and also the broader public conceptualize determinants of health and for policy decisions about allocation of resources to improve population health and promote health equity. So the very quick answer to this question, and then you can leave if you like, is that no, causes cannot be summed to 100%. As I shall argue today, for at least 80 years since the mid-1930s, the scientific and mathematical argument has been clear. To the extent that multiple factors contribute independently and synergistically to causal pathways leading to any particular health outcome, the sum of their contributions must exceed 100%. Additionally, the percent variation of outcomes that is quote-unquote explained by particular factors is not at all equivalent to the proportion of risk causally attributed to these factors. But these mistakes keep happening, and I fear can take our work down the wrong path. So the roadmap for my talk today is as follows. I'll start by reviewing several high-profile cases of work seeking to have causes add up to 100% and the debates that they have engendered. These include, first, current projects to rank counties and states in the U.S. in relation to their health determinants and health status. Second, the famous Dahl and Peto paper in 1981 on the causes of cancer and its revisions. Third, the 2015 uproar over whether 2/3 of cancer is due to chance. I'll then share my views on why the incisive and sound refutations of this approach seem not to stick, for which I'll first revisit a famous debate in the 1930s between Hogben and Fisher over the proportioning of, quote, nature versus nurture, versus their interdependence, which I'll then flesh out with an eco-social analysis that takes into account embodied history, structured chance, flexible phenotypes, and health equity. I'll close by presenting some alternative empirical approaches to what I believe are the real questions at hand: how to quantify the health impacts in relation to health equity. So let me start, however, by taking a moment to introduce the theoretical underpinnings of my approach, because my perspective and talk, like any other, is grounded in a conceptual framework. Briefly stated, the ecosocial theory of disease distribution, which I first proposed in 1994 and have been elaborating since, is centrally concerned with who and what drives current and changing patterns of social inequalities in health. Ecosocial theory accordingly pays heed to societal and ecological context, to life course and historical generations, to levels of analysis, and to interrelationships between diverse forms of social inequality, including racism, class, and gender, among others. A key focus is on embodiment, referring to how we literally embody biologically our societal and ecological context across levels and generations, thereby creating population patterns of health, disease, and health inequities. Another is on accountability and agency, both for social inequalities in health and for the ways they are or are not monitored, analyzed, and addressed. So moving now to the question of whether causes can add up to 100%, consider this figure taken from a current, very influential website, the County Health Rankings and Roadmap, Building a Culture of Health County by County. The website is supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is renowned for supporting strategic work on population health and health equity. As you can see, the causes of health outcomes, so-called, are divvied up into several large categories whose percentages tally to 100%. Technically, these are weights applied to z-scores computed for each exposure, and the framework is that of explaining variance. Working up from the bottom, physical environment garners 10%, social and economic factors another 40%, clinical care at 20%, and finally health behaviors at 30%. The implication is that if one wants to intervene to alter health outcomes, however defined, the top-ranked cause is quote-unquote social and economic factors, followed by health behaviors, then clinical care, then the physical environment. A similar approach at the state level is offered by America's Health Rankings, which is sponsored by the United Health Foundation and the American Heart Association. For their approach, however, they create a score which apportion causes as 25% for behavior, 22.5% for community and environment, 12.5% for policies, 15% for clinical care, and 25% for outcomes. Yet seeing this slide and hearing about these alternative causal partitionings, several questions should immediately come to mind. First, is it plausible to say that quote-unquote social and economic factors account for only 40% of health outcomes, given strong evidence that these social and economic factors shape quote-unquote health behaviors and also access to and quality of clinical care? Second, are these allocations intended to hold across all health outcomes, however defined? Third, given rising awareness of the current and growing impact of global climate change on ecosystem health, human health, and also health inequities, is it plausible to say that the physical environment contributes only 10% to health outcomes? And fourth, to whom do these percent allocations apply? And if even intended for the US total population, for what time period? These questions, I hope, should make you all begin to wonder about not simply the percent allocation to different categories, but about the very exercise of producing such partitioning of causes. At issue is the false belief that causes can be summed to 100% and a companion problem of equating variation with being the same as accounting for causal impact. Of course, the approach taken by the previous figure is not new, and neither are the rebuttals to refute this approach. In this field, we've been here many times before, in fact. I'll start with a related controversy that involves the highly influential 1981 report by two eminent scientists, Sir Richard Dahl and Sir Richard Peto, on the causes, quote, the causes of cancer, quantitative estimates of avoidable risks of cancer in the United States today, end quote, which was commissioned by the US government and published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute to help inform priorities for a vividly named, quote unquote, war on cancer, which had been declared 10 years earlier in 1971 under the Nixon administration. The key table, Table 20, is shown on this slide. As per the previous slide, the percentages add up to 100%, but are both a different kind of percent, and they also apportion causation quite differently. What is shown are the population attributable fractions, which were first introduced in the epidemiologic literature in the 1950s and have been a topic of debate and consternation ever since. The basic idea is to calculate the percent of cases that would have been prevented if everyone had the same risk of exposure as persons with the most favorable exposure, and that may potentially be no exposure. The calculation of the PAF, as it's called, thus depends on both the prevalence of exposure and the risk associated with this exposure. Of note, in this table, factors that the county roadmap would deem health behaviors come in at a whopping 75%. And the only category matching up to the roadmap's social and economic factors, which is unemployment, garners only 4%, which was an estimate that back in 1981 generated a furor. The deeper point, however, is not about arguments about the percent allocated or whether the percentages would have been different, say, for cancer mortality as opposed to, say, more tuberculosis. At issue is whether this exercise has any scientific validity at all. Indeed, as the quotes from the paper to the side of the table make clear, both Dahl and Peto were quite cognizant that causes cannot be summed to 100%. To them, the reasons for this problem was, and I quote, some agents interact with others to produce effects that are much greater than the sum of the separate effects of the same two agents, end quote. This led them to state, and I again quote, that, quote, this difficulty means it is inappropriate to present a neat balance sheet adding up to 100%, end quote. Nevertheless, they did so, and Table 20 was enormously influential in setting priorities. They believed that their table was justified because, in their view, the problem of interaction was relatively rare. They accordingly stated, quote, we shall therefore ignore the anomaly in the rest of this paper and hope that once it has been pointed out, no one will fall into the trap of adding together proportions that are not, in fact, mutually exclusive, end quote. Except that, unfortunately, many did fall into this trap and still do so today. Only 4 years later, however, Peto changed his table. The revised Table 1 shown here is now framed as providing estimates of population attributable fractions that might be observed in the future, were we to have better data. And these estimates, interesting, are virtually identical to those in the 1981 publication. There are, however, two noteworthy changes. First, Peto added a new line for total equals 200% or more. And second, the new footnote to the table states that, quote, since one cancer may have two or more causes, the grand total in such a table will probably, when more knowledge is available, greatly exceed 200. It is merely a coincidence that the suggestive figures in Table 1 happen to add up to about 100%, end quote. This is quite a change from the 1981 conceptualization. Moreover, Peto's new table number 2 tabulated what he thought was reliably known about the, quote, percentage of all US or UK deaths, cancer deaths thus known to be avoidable, end quote, for which the percentages notably added up to only about 40%. Even more interesting is what Peto has to say about the causes of cancer. I quote, cancer arises from 3 things: nature, nurture, and luck. In large populations, nature and luck seem generally to average out, and only nurture remains. So study of cancer rates in relation to nurture tells us about the role of external factors, which is, both for government policy and for individual choices, the only thing of practical importance, end quote. Keep in mind this trio of nature, nurture, and luck, because I will return to them shortly. Despite the clear recognition in the 1980s, that is over 30 years ago, that it is incorrect, as in flat out wrong, to try to force causes of population health to equal 100%, reminders keep being offered and clearly are needed, as per the County Roadmap website. Thus, in no uncertain terms, the World Health Organization World Health Report 2002, Reducing Risk, Promoting Healthy Life, clearly stated that, quote, causes can add up to more than 100%, end quote, because, quote, the fact that diseases and injuries are caused by the joint action of 2 or more risk factors means that the sum of the separate contributions can easily be more than 100%, end quote. The example provided concerned a smoker who is a heavy drinker who develops throat cancer. Parsing out contributions of causes of throat cancer thus requires considering minimally 3 different causal scenarios, one in which, quote, smoking and alcohol work together with other environmental and genetic causes to result in disease, end quote, one in which, quote, throat cancer develops in a non-drinker, end quote, and a third in which throat cancer is caused by, quote, genetic and some unknown environmental causes, end quote. As the authors of this report clearly explain, quote, if the scenarios were equally common, 66.6% of throat cancer would be attributable to smoking, 33.3% to alcohol, 100% to genetic causes, and 100% to unknown environmental causes, making a total of 300%. Causes can and ideally should total to more than 100%. This is an inevitable result of different causes working together to produce disease, end quote. Far from being daunted by this insight, the report goes on to say that the reality of, quote, multi-causality means that in many cases, considerable gains can be achieved by reducing risks to health that are already known, end quote. Despite such caveats and explications, attempts to sum the causes of population to health to 100% keep resurfacing, as do debates over the meaning of population attributable risk. Indeed, in 2015, a special issue of the Annals of Epidemiology was devoted to clarifying issues involving interpretation as well as calculation of population attributable fractions, or PAFs. As stated in one review article on the PAF, quote, shared causal responsibility among causes requires that PAFs can add up to more than 100%, end quote, and the author Poole devoted considerable energy to excoriating work that fails to understand this point. Further highlighting how this penchant for 100% just will not go away, consider the major controversy in early 2015 over a very high-profile article in Science by Tomasetti and Vogelstein, which claimed that 2/3 of cancer is primarily due to chance, a claim that would, of course, kick all of Dahl and Peto's estimates, whether adding up to 100%, 200%, or any other number, to the trash bin of history. A slew of articles subsequently have appeared challenging the article, which again got incredibly widespread media coverage throughout the world, and they challenged the article conceptually, methodologically, and substantively. Let me take a moment to describe the issues at stake because they bear heavily on how people think about tallying up causes. In brief, Tomasetti and Vogelstein's claim is that, as stated in the title of their article, variation in cancer risk among organs, for example, why colon cancer is common and bone cancer is rare, quote, can be explained by the number of stem cell divisions and thus chance. Considering a selected number of cancer sites, they presented data suggesting that, quote, the lifetime risk of cancers of many different types is strongly correlated, 0.81, with the total number of divisions of the normal self-renewing cells maintaining that tissue's homeostasis, end quote. Having computed this R, they then squared it to get an R-squared value, whereby 0.81 times 0.81 equals 0.65, leading them to assert that, quote, 65% of the differences in cancer risk among tissues can be explained by the number of stem cell divisions in those tissues, end quote. The figure of 65% in turn led them to assert that, quote, only 1/3 of the variation in tissue risk among tissues is attributable to environmental factors or inherited predispositions, end quote. Why 1/3? because the assumption that causes of variance, hence quote-unquote causes, must total to 100%, and thus if 2/3 of cancer is quote-unquote due to chance, then only 1/3 can be due to other causes, whether genetic or environmental. Underscoring the continued appeal of this alarming and erroneous type of reasoning, shortly thereafter, the New England Journal of Medicine published a rapturous defense of Tomasetti and Vogelstein's argument. Not everyone, however, was or is convinced. In fact, devastating critiques have been published by a goodly number of leading biostatisticians and population health and cancer researchers. I'll focus on the next slide on the problems in the approach to summing up causes, but here I want to flag that controversies exist even about the data presented, let alone their analysis and interpretation. Thus, senior researchers have even challenged the stem cell division data employed, especially the over-reliance on extrapolating from mice data on stem cell replications to humans. For example, and I quote, "The mouse small intestinal stem cells undergo more divisions than the mouse large intestinal stem cells, which is the opposite for humans," end quote. In other words, it appears to be necessary to be skeptical about not only the statistical claims, but about the very data themselves. However, even if Tomasetti and Vogelstein's data were 100% valid, their statistical analysis and interpretation and approach to thinking about causality, including the summing of causes to 100%, remains deeply flawed. An elegant and concise critique is provided in this paper, quote, "Is mad luck the main cause of cancer," end quote, which was co-authored by Clarice Weinberg and Dmitry Zakin, who are both biostatisticians at NIEHS, and attesting to her expertise, Weinberg is also the statistical editor for the American Journal of Epidemiology. On the slide, I list their 3 key critiques, and the one relevant especially to today is point number 3, quote, "One cannot partition causes into fractions that add up to 1, end quote. The first example they use is one which by now should be an old saw because it is the same one that Brian McMahon presented back in 1968 in a review article on, quote, "gene-environment interaction," end quote. The case is that of phenylketonuria, or PKU, and as I'm sure many of you know, PKU is an inherited recessive disorder which results in a harmful buildup of the amino acid phenylalanine, which is a common component of food with high protein. This disease can be and is entirely prevented by restricting the intake of this amino acid. Hence, PKU can, depending on context, be framed as solely a genetic disease, attributable risk equals 1, or as an environmental disease, attributable risk equals 1, thereby yielding attributable fractions totaling to 200%. Where Weinberg and Zakin extended the argument is to bring in chance as a causal factor in disease etiology. They tellingly used the example of prostate cancer, noting that it could be claimed that 100% of prostate cancer is due to a stochastic event, that is chance, which is that of inheriting a Y chromosome, but this, quote, "does not relieve us of the need to search out other causes, some of which may be preventable." So despite at least 50 years of refutation in the epidemiologic literature, if we count back to McMahon's critique in the 1960s, it seems that the impulse to make causes of population health add up to 100% is still strong. Why? An ecosocial analysis leads me to venture that the reason the problem won't go away is because of 3 unresolved, long-standing, and intertwined conceptually difficult controversies, each of which is value-laden and politically fraught. Although all 3 controversies have been discussed at length in the literature, to my knowledge, they have not been analyzed in relation to the issue of forcing causes to add up to 100% and what that means for work on health equity. In brief, I would argue that one key reason for the endurance of this scientific error is the long-standing preoccupation within science, medicine, and public health of pitting quote-unquote nature against quote-unquote nurture and arguing over which contributes more to shaping individual traits and population health. Also at issue are 2 related ongoing debates, one involving disputes between dominant reductionist and individualistic frameworks, methods against holistic and contextual approaches, as crystallized in the perennial debate over whether the whole equals or is greater than the sum of the parts, and the other over whether populations versus individuals each shape or determine the characteristics of the other. And to the extent that these debates remain politically and ideologically fraught, so too will scientific literature see repeated rounds of work that seeks to make causes add up to 100% and rebuttals demonstrating the fallacy of this approach. Better data alone will not resolve this issue. Intellectual clarity is instead required about the underlying intellectual and social tensions so as to spur better understanding and methods. By way of background, which I'll keep brief because I want to get to the empirical examples, the perennial debate over nature versus nurture refers to a cleavage first formally pronounced in 1874 by Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin and a key architect of eugenics. Core to this idea was that an organism's traits, its phenotype, can be neatly partitioned into aspects caused by the quote-unquote genes and aspects caused by the quote-unquote environment, by default typically defined as anything but the genes. From this standpoint, heredity trumps environment, and the contribution of nature versus nurture at the individual level necessarily underlies observed differences at the population level, given the premise that populations are merely aggregates of individuals. The trick, however, is that this kind of partition of nature versus nurture can only be done statistically at the population level, because for any given individual, no trait exists except for an organism expressing its biology, genetic and otherwise, in the context of its ecosystem. In other words, welcome to the world of developmental biology, and especially ecological evolutionary development biology, otherwise known as eco-evo-devo. The logical and scientific fallacy discussed ad nauseum in the literature is that partition of variance at the population level cannot be equated with or interpreted as being the same as the contribution of causes at the individual level. They are not the same. From this standpoint, the only way that a trait can be said to be 100% due to quote-unquote genetics is that it will be invariably expressed in all individuals regardless of environmental variability, that is, context. By the same token, a trait that is said to be 100% due to environment can only work if it is invariably expressed in all individual organisms regardless of their genetic variability. Such extremes do exist, but they are not the sorts of health outcomes about which debates rage. For example, no human fetus will survive if it is missing one of its chromosomes, number 1, regardless of environmental context. Similarly, no humans will survive if they breathe carbon monoxide at concentrations of greater than 200 parts per million for prolonged intervals, regardless of their genome. By and large, however, most traits or outcomes do not inhabit the realm of these extremes. Rather, they reside in the world of flexible phenotypes, whereby across the life course, context is shaping biological development and gene expression, and organisms are busily shaping their contexts as assisted and influenced by also their microbiomes, among other things, meaning other DNA. This, of course, greatly complicates the static notion of adding up causes to 100%. Typically, trait dependence on context is discussed in terms of norms of reaction, whereby a given organism, if cloned, may exhibit different phenotypic features if it develops under different conditions, in ways that are bounded by both its genome and context. On this slide, I show 3 classic examples. One shows 2 genetically identical plants, one reared in conditions of low light, the other in intensive light, and as you can see, their appearance in terms of both leaf shape and density is remarkably different. The second shows Cece, the world's first cloned cat, at age 1 with her mother, and do note the different coat coloring. The third shows the case of sea turtles, one of many species of reptiles whose biological sex depends on the temperature at which the eggs incubate. Again, no change in genome, just a change in gene expression brought about by physical context. Thus, as explained by the evolutionary developmental biologist Scott Gilbert, quote, developmental plasticity, sometimes called phenotypic plasticity, is the notion that the genome enables the organism to produce a range of phenotypes. There is not a single phenotype produced by a particular genotype. When developmental plasticity manifests itself as a continuous spectrum of phenotypes expressed by a single genotype across a range of environmental conditions, this spectrum is called the norm of reaction or reaction norm. The reaction norm can also be selected, end quote. It is important to be clear, however, that differential expression of phenotype is not a one-time deal and is also not something passively shaped by the quote-unquote environment. Capturing this dynamic reality is a new term I found compelling, that of the flexible phenotype. I prefer it to the more common term plastic as per phenotypic plasticity, because plastic is a noun that comes from the world of arts and refers to, quote, that which is molded, end quote, as if an inert object, that is, clay or stone, were being sculpted by some outside active force. But life is way more interesting and engaged and complicated than that. I first came across this term when reading a recent book tellingly titled The Flexible Phenotype, A Body-Centered Integration of Ecology, Physiology, and Behavior, which was written by 2 Dutch ecologists, Piersma and Van Gils, who study migrating birds. A key insight was that there wasn't just one answer to the question, what is the size of any given bird's guts or its muscle types, because the answer to this question depended on where the bird was in its migratory cycle. That is, exact same bird, exact same genome, different phenotype. This led them to reframe the phenotype as instead being a flexible phenotype, exhibiting dynamic changes and involving changes in gene expression across the life cycle. The figure shown in the center of the slide depicts various organisms which markedly change their phenotypic appearance and behaviors during the course of their lifetimes in relation to seasonal and other ecosystem changes. Other examples include the many species of fish who repeatedly can and do switch their biological sex over the course of their life, with these changes triggered by both the presence of predators and also by the sexual composition of the school of fish in which they happen to be swimming. As for one species that displays enormous phenotypic flexibility, we'll simply look around the room. And here I again quote Gilbert, who states with regard to humans, quote, "Our examples of developmental plasticity are so prevalent that we have given their study different names: nutrition, immunology, neurobiology, and perhaps even orthodontic dentistry. Were I to reside long enough in the Andes or the Alps, I would develop red blood cells more efficiently due to a developmental system that produces more erythropoietin in response to oxygen deprivation," end quote. Continuing in this vein are the myriad findings of what's now being called, quote unquote, post-genetics, that is research findings post-dating the sequencing of the human genome. One fundamental insight relevant to the parsing of causes are that genomes are not simply aggregations of strings of dictatorial genes. Instead, genomes are complex, dynamic, networked, and responsive systems. Hence, in the words of Evelyn Fox Keller, a leading scholar who writes extensively on genetics, quote, "If much of what the genome does is to respond to signals from the environment, then bifurcation of developmental influences into categories of genetic and environmental makes no sense," end quote. With this background in mind, I think you're all now in a better place conceptually to think critically about a key causal debate that took place in 1933 between two major population health researchers in the UK, and which resonates for us in the field to this day. The two scientists involved were first Lancelot Hogben, an experimental embryologist and population geneticist with a strong mathematical background, who was the author of the 1937 worldwide bestseller, Mathematics for the Millions, as well as a 1946 text, An Introduction to Mathematical Genetics. And the other was R.A. Fisher, a biostatistician who was immortalized for many of you by way of the ANOVA and its F test, and yes, F stands for Fisher. Among many other things, Fisher was an ardent eugenicist, at a time when eugenicists, I emphasize, were not crackpots, but instead represented the dominant scientific viewpoint in Europe and the US prior to World War II. By contrast, Hogben, who had more progressive leanings, was appalled by what he considered to be the shoddy thinking and alleged evidence proffered by the eugenicists. Not only is the debate that they had still ongoing, but it is central to our story here. In brief, by the early 1930s, Hogben had begun to amass biological evidence of ways in which biological development of genetically identical organisms, in his case fruit flies, but he was aware of similar phenomena in other species, could be modified by the environmental context. This suggested to him that a simple parsing of genes versus environment, as Fisher was popularizing, made no sense. He wrote to Fisher in 1933 to ask what Fisher saw as the implication of saying that 90% of observed variation between two groups was due to heredity, with this question pointedly asking, quote, "Do you mean that the variance would be reduced to 10% if the environment were uniform? Do you mean the variance would be reduced by 90% if all genetic differences were eliminated," end quote. He couched his question as if it were a simple one, saying, "Perhaps you will think the question silly," end quote. But in fact, it took two exchanges of letters before Fisher understood what Hogben was asking. Fisher's response? Effectively, that the dependence of gene expression on environment, which he reframed as, quote, nonlinear interactions of environment and heredity, end quote, was indeed a silly academic concern, since in Fisher's view, such types of quote-unquote interactions were quote-unquote exceptional, that is, exceedingly rare and of no import, or else could be dealt with by some relevant data transformation to make the effects once again additive. Obviously, Hogben disagreed considerably, and in his masterpiece, Nature and Nurture, also published in 1933, he reframed the issue in an entirely new way, one of, quote, the interdependence of nature and nurture, end quote, a phrase that he coined, and he described example after example which made clear that such interdependence is the norm, not the exception, as also underscored by the additional examples I have shared with you. Expressing this insight and its implications for apportioning causes, Hogben wrote, quote, "Clearly, we are on safe ground when we speak of a genetic difference between two groups measured in one and the same environment, or in speaking of a difference due to environment when identical stocks are measured under different conditions of development. Are we on equally safe ground when we speak of the contribution of heredity and environment to measurement of genetically different individuals or groups measured in different kinds of environments? The question is easily seen to be devoid of definite meaning," end quote. Underscoring the public health implications of this insight, Hogben also devastatingly wrote, quote, "Curiously enough, eugenicists who profess to be interested in promoting knowledge about human inheritance bitterly oppose social reforms directed to equalize the human environment," end quote. Interestingly, the Hogben versus Fisher debate, long shelved, has in the past decade once again attracted attention among historians and philosophers of science, especially Evelyn Fox Keller, Helen Longino, and James Tabary. But to date, none of these new reflections have explored the ramifications of this debate for the thesis that causes must add up to one. So let me now transition to an alternative ecosocial framing to the issues that we're discussing. Building on Hogben's insight about the interdependence of so-called nature and nurture, and mindful as well that chance is a key element of both, a point to which I'll return in a moment, what I will argue is that we need to see population health as embodied history, a framing that better allows us to ask questions about population health and health inequities. I'll start by noting that a key ecosocial metaphor for understanding embodiment is fractal and involves the integral intertwining of the societal and biological at every level, from planetary and macrosocial down to the nanoscale. As emblematic of the dynamic processes that produce fractal branching structures, consider how, in pattern, shape, and size of its branches, a tree literally wears its history for all to see, such that when we see a tree, we see literally embodied history. Core to this approach to understanding health inequities and to framing causal contributions is the idea of what I call structured chance. It is a concept that directly challenges the conventional view that populations construed as simply aggregate phenomena are defined by the innate and inherited characteristics of the individuals of which they are comprised, that is, essentialism mixed with methodological individualism. This dominant view is expressed by the figure to the right, that of the quincunx, which was designed in 1889 by Sir Francis Galton, who not only, I mentioned previously, was the first to formally partition nature and nurture, but he also did coin the term eugenics and invented the correlation coefficient in his quest to prove that population distributions, including of intelligence, were a product of heredity, not environment. Galton designed his quincunx so that identical pellets poured through a funnel that randomly bounced off carefully placed pins would fall into different bins and produce a normal distribution, with the height of the column reflecting the probability of different pathways of descent. To Galton, this device beautifully demonstrated the properties of what he called, quote, the law of frequency of error, end quote, a law that he claimed, quote, would have been personified by the Greeks and deified if they had known of it. Each element, as it is sorted into place, finds, as it were, a preordained niche, accurately adapted to fit it, end quote. To Galton, the placement of the pins, that is, the structure, was a given that receded into the background. Consider, however, the alternative mechanical device shown to the left. It was built by several late 20th century physicists who altered the shape of the funnel and the pins in order to generate a log normal curve, that is, the logarithm of the values has a normal distribution. Illustrating the interplay of structure and chance, it thus offers an illuminating mechanical metaphor for showing how altered structures can change population distributions, including of identical individuals, and do so by affecting the underlying probabilities of events randomly occurring to these populations' individuals. Relevant to the expression of norms of reaction and flexible phenotypes, the construct of structured chance helps clarify why individual risk and population parameters are necessarily conjoined. We are always and simultaneously individuals and members of populations. The implication is that observed differences between populations are simply that, observed differences in a given context, not self-evident clear-cut indicators of innate difference. The observed distribution is conjointly a function of the structure of the pins and the properties of the balls. Remove one or the other or declare them to be independent causes of the observed distribution, and there will be no distribution of any sort whatsoever. The very phenomena of inquiry will no longer exist. From this standpoint, Chance is not counterpoise to nature or nurture, as Tomasetti and Vogelstein's article tried to argue for cancer. Moreover, as per Hogben's argument from 80 years ago, it is clearly not meaningful to ask in a context of complex dynamic societies what % of health outcomes or any trait at either the population or individual level can be quote unquote explained by any given component cause, whether genetic or environmental, without taking into account context dependency. The literature on complexity science, system science, and emergent properties makes very clear that it's only at the population level that we can see structures that shape changes at individual level. It is precisely for this reason that epidemiology as a population science affords unique insights about the multi-level determinants of population distributions of disease and health, and cannot and never will predict individual risk. This is an argument also cogently expressed by my fellow epidemiologist George Davies Smith in 2011, among others. Structured chance is what allows us to see this possibility more clearly, and the structuring plays out over time and different spatial scales as well. And as for the structuring of chance in our society, to ground the health examples I will next present, I start by offering a quick reminder of the ugly social facts in which U.S. health inequities are ensconced. This slide shows the current, sorry, and all too familiar data on U.S. racial ethnic inequities and distributions of wealth, poverty, incarceration, unemployment, and medical insurance using the most recent national data available. Growing concentrations of wealth and mounting income inequality now rival their 20th century high, reached in 1929, right before the stock market crash and the Great Depression. 2 years ago, in February 2014, the New York Times reported that the ratio of incomes of the top 0.1% of U.S. households to the average household in the bottom 90% grew from 47 to 1 in 1980 to an astounding 206 to 1 in 2011. And tied to these trends, the U.S. black-white wealth gap, having started to shrink in the late 1980s, has since 2004 been on the rise, such that in 2013, the median household wealth for whites was 13 times higher than that for black households, up from 8 times higher in 1983. Related, ratio of CEO to worker compensation grew from about 20 to 1 in 1965 to upwards of 354 to 1 in 2014, albeit, I might say, without evidence of astounding gains in CEO productivity. Another study reported that in 2014, the $28.5 billion in bonuses bestowed on Wall Street employees was double the annual pay for 1,007,000 U.S. workers who work full-time at minimum wage jobs. Moreover, at the Davos Forum this past January, Oxfam reported that, quote, runaway inequality has created a world in which 62 people own as much as the poorest half of the world's population, end quote, and that, quote, this number has fallen dramatically from 388 as recently as 2010 and 80 last year, end quote. Suggesting, however, that these basic facts are not exactly well known and or are discounted, results of a new national probability survey was released this past June by the Pew Research Center that was titled tellingly, quote, on views of racial equality, blacks and whites are worlds apart, end quote. Thus, despite the data shown on this slide, fully 37% of the U.S. white population and 36% of the Hispanic population and even 30% of the black population agreed that, quote, the average black person, quote, is just about as well off as the average white person, end quote. Further pointing to the enormous chasm in understanding of racial injustice, fully 62% of the U.S. white population opined that their race or ethnicity, quote, hadn't made much difference for them to succeed in life, end quote. And only 53% of the whites, as compared to 88% of the blacks and 70% of the Hispanics, agree that our country needs to do more to give blacks equal rights, even as we know that the equality of rights, however necessary, is insufficient to assure substantive equality. Even more sobering, whereas about 40% of both blacks and whites believe the U.S. would make these changes, nevertheless, fully 43% of the black population, as compared to only 11% of the white population, thought the U.S. will never make these changes. These are sobering social facts, and they ground the challenges our work needs to be addressed. As I hope should now be clear, the question we confront is not the extent to which different causes add up to 100% in defining population or individual risk of disease. That is not a meaningful question. Instead, from a health equity standpoint, the question is, to what extent are observed differences in health status between societal groups avoidable, unnecessary, and unfair? And related, how does this vary by time, place, and social group? These are valid empirical questions that we can ask and answer. So let me return first to Hogben. As part of taking on the nature versus nurture divide in the 1930s, he drew on public health to better ways of quantifying and communicating the impact of diverse factors on population health, a topic central to contemporary initiatives to advance health equity impact assessment and to promote health in all policies. Specifically, Hogben offered a potent parable as follows, and I'll read, quote, "Imagine a city after a prolonged siege or blockade ending over a number of years. The available supplies of food containing necessary vitamins have long since been exhausted in the open market. Young children are still growing stunted as a consequence and weigh on average 20% less than pre-war children. One biochemist has a small stock of crystallized vitamins which he has reserved for his family of 4 who grow up normally. There are, say, 1 million stunted children to 4 healthy ones. A party of rabid environmentalists is clamoring for peace. The government appoints an official inquiry of statisticians. They report that far less than 1% of the observed variance with respect to body weight is due to differences in diet, that the improvement produced by change in diet, if peace were made, would therefore be negligible, and that eugenic selection would solve the problem of how to keep the community alive with vitamins if the war could be prolonged for a few more millennia. It requires no subtlety to see what is wrong with this conclusion. If only 4 in 1 million and 4 children had sufficient vitamins for normal growth, the effect of differences in vitamin content of the diet to the observed variance in the population would be a statistically negligible quantity. In spite of this, the mean body weight of the population could be increased by 30% if all children had received a ration with a vitamin content equivalent to the greatest amount available to any child in the same population," end quote. His thought population thus anticipates not only the computation of socially relevant PAFs, but also Rose's 1985 insight that uniform exposure across groups means the exposure will not be detected as a cause of group differences in outcomes, and it underscores the problem of parsing cause without appreciation of context. So jumping to the present, I note that a similar logic and approach, akin to that used by Hogben, notably underlies a new study that estimates the impact on premature mortality of raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour in New York City. Results, including sensitivity analyses taking into account the impact of such a raise on other income levels and also possible job loss, indicate not only what the impact could be on the on-average citywide reduction of premature mortality rates, the estimate was a 4 to 8% decline, translating to 2,800 to 5,500 premature deaths averted, but also, quote, "Most of these avertible deaths would be realized in lower income communities in which the residents are predominantly people of color," end quote. Analogous methods have been used to estimate the proportion and number of premature deaths that could be averted if everyone had the same and already achieved age-specific mortality rates as persons in the most affluent groups. For example, the recent study by Galea et al. Estimated deaths attributable to social factors in the US and did so without requiring that PAFs for these factors sum to 100%. Key findings were that approximately, quote, 245,000 deaths in the US in 2000 were attributable to low education, 176,000 to racial segregation, 162,000 to low social support, 133,000 to individual level poverty, 119,000 to income inequality, and 39,000 to area poverty, end quote. These are not small numbers. They were on par with the number of deaths for such leading causes of death as acute myocardial infarctions, which is about 193,000, and cerebral vascular disease, which is about 168,000, and also lung cancer, about 155,000. Moreover, when discussing the limitations of the PAF, the paper rightly noted that, quote, "The 6 social factors considered are highly interrelated, thus deaths attributed to each factor are not necessarily mutually exclusive," end quote. Yet even the smallest n is a non-trivial number of averted deaths. And literally putting these sorts of inequities on the proverbial map, this slide shows the results of a novel study that my team and I conducted in Boston a decade ago. What this map displays is the Bonnell-based proportion of premature deaths that would have not occurred if residents of every census tract enjoyed the same age-specific premature mortality rates as residents of the least impoverished census tracts. This proportion exceeded 20% for 8, fully half of Boston's 16 neighborhoods, and also for nearly 70% of Boston's 156 census tracts. Moreover, within 2 of Boston's poorest neighborhoods, Roxbury and North Dorchester, in more than half of their census tracts, this excess fraction reached 25 to 30%. This means that for these areas, for every 100 deaths among people under age 75, 25 to 30 of these deaths would not have happened at this younger age if people in this neighborhood had, at each and every age, the same lower risk of dying as people in the richer areas. This is a shocking statistic, one which we shared with the Boston Public Health Commission, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and several community groups, and which has helped inform efforts to redress glaring inequities in premature mortality. For example, building on these types of data, the Center for Health Equity and Social Justice, based in the Boston Commission for Public Health, in September 2010 launched a new campaign called What's Your Health Code? As stated by Nashira Burrell, then co-director of the center and now somebody also at the Chan School, quote, "When the city was embarking on the new campaign, focus groups were convened to tap into residents' attitudes. When asked initially about the health of individuals, the groups talked about the need for overweight to exercise more," Burrell said. "But when asked, what do you think impacts a community's health, we got very different answers," she said. "That's when they told us to build parks and take other steps to make the whole community healthier," end quote. The campaign included billboards, ads placed on the bus and subway, a YouTube video, an interactive website, a Facebook page, and a TV commercial. With the websites including links to myriad resources about neighborhood conditions and advocacy groups and city initiatives that people can get involved with to improve conditions. Moreover, by regrounding health within communities, the campaign notably countered all too common view that health is just a personal matter and reflects your genetics or bad habits or possibly individual bad luck. Making context is critical to changing it, and we have the capacity to do it. Consider as well additional possibilities for equity-oriented PAFs. For example, building on the ranking approach of the County Health Ranking and America's Health Rankings, imagine rankings which communities would benefit most from a change of exposures, albeit without constraining causes to add to 100%. Thus, for any given community, however defined, that is by geography and/or social or economic group, it would be possible to compute both the proportion and absolute number of adverse outcomes averted where the distribution of exposures changed, thereby showing who would most benefit. The health equity impact could thus be transparently portrayed. Moreover, the magnitude of the impact could be compared across different scenarios involving diverse exposures, all without imposing the assumption that the contribution of component causes sum to 100%. Granted, in this era of big data and fast computing, more computationally intensive simulation approaches, including agent-based modeling, could be used heuristically to quantify potential impacts of changing distributions and levels of exposures. These approaches likewise do not require causes to be independent or to have their relative contributions sum to 100%. As is well recognized, however, simulations are only as good as their data and their assumptions. And as Hogben also warned, when powerful statistical techniques are employed, it is always necessary to be alert, quote, to the danger of concealing assumptions which may have no factual basis behind an impressive facade of flawless algebra, end quote. The basic point is that the public's health and work to attain health equity are ill-served by and do not require methodologic approaches that err in assuming that causes sum to 100% and that confuse explaining variation with explaining causation. Nor need it be assumed that cause can be discretely partitioned, in Peto's words, between nature, nurture, and luck. To the contrary, these three components are at play in every case, and every non-case are in no way mutually exclusive. The signal contribution of population health sciences is that they render it possible to both see and detect the population-level forces not visible at the individual level that structure risks of exposure and outcomes across social groups. To quote from Hogben once again, quote, "A human society may be crudely compared to a badly managed laboratory in which there are many cages, each containing a pair of rats and their offspring. The rats are of different breeds. The cages are at different distances from the window. Different cages receive different rations. Rats in the same cage cannot all get to the feeding trough together, so some get more meal than others. The cage corresponds to the family as a unit of environment. The rats in each cage constitute the family as a genetic unit," end quote. As this metaphor makes clear, it is essential to analyze causes and to compute PAFs, keeping in mind both space and place and the distribution of resources, power, and the structural determination of health inequities over time within and across historical generations. Indeed, as Greenland and Robbins observed nearly 30 years ago regarding the interpretation of PAFs, quote, "The dependency of epidemiologic measures on cofactor distributions points out the need to consider such measures as biological constants. Rather, epidemiologic measures are characteristics of particular populations under particular conditions," end quote. PAFs and percent variation explained by implication are and must be historically contingent. And this is yet another reason that no fixed summing to 100% is ever possible. In closing, when it comes to matters of life, health, and death, we humans, like other biological species, are not and have never been purely biological organisms or purely social beings. We are both simultaneously. It is only through living in and engaging in our co-constituted societies and ecosystems in real time that we develop and express our existence as simultaneously social and biological beings. These are our embodied realities, as underscored by the ecosocial theory of disease distribution, with its emphasis again on how we literally embody biologically our societal and ecological context, thereby producing population patterns of health, disease, and well-being. It is way past time to reject the false premises and logic of the idea that, quote, causes can be discretely apportioned between nature, nurture, and chance. And we also have to discard the idea that component causes must sum up to 100%. The focus instead should shift to transparent methods to quantify the toll of health inequities and progress toward their eradication. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. We have a few minutes for questions. If you'd like to come up to the microphone and identify yourself before asking your question. We have about 10 minutes, so please go ahead.
I'm sure someone has a question. I know that was a lot to take in conceptually, but that's sort of part of the point, which is to be able to use a talk like this to paint a much larger conceptual picture in which many of our assumptions that go into individual studies are amply revealed. But also, as you see, it takes you through a lot, but it has direct, immediate relevance to the work that you do.
Hi, I'm Bill Wyzorek from SUNY Buffalo State. Thank you for this really pulling together these kinds of concepts. The question I have is that, then could you talk about how might you embody this? What are the implications, for example, in the Wisconsin Health Ratings County data? You know, what does it mean on that kind of practical level of what would you suggest instead, or how does that get altered?
So I think that's an important point, and I've had discussions with them. And one of the things, when I first began to explore these ideas, it was because actually I was asked last year to go an Institute of Medicine panel to discuss approaches, because there was a lot of debate happening within the panel, this is one on population health and health equity, about how do you argue what % of causes is due to social factors, and that this is a useful way of communicating to politicians. But there's a problem there, of policymakers or whoever the mythical people are that are allegedly paying attention to these data. And there's a problem, which is that if you're going to take on the rubric of saying that we do evidence-based approaches, you can't use methods that are scientifically invalid. It's not a good idea. It's easy to pick apart, and anyone from progressive, conservative, or any other standpoint can tear it apart. So that's one problem immediately, saying that, well, we're going to say that if you invest all your resources, 40% into social and environmental factors, you will change health in this way. That's not going to be a helpful way of framing the problem, and the different approach that I'm offering about if you actually do these kinds of interventions or policies and come up with a health equity impact population attributable fraction, that's a much more realistic sense of saying what should a particular policy, what will its impact have, what will its intervention have, and it's not only just about consciously formulated policies, it's about the residue of what's happened with regard to the different distributions of wealth in this country due to the way Social Security was first formed in 1935 and the many generation impact of that. So it has a really different way of framing the question and not having people also think that, oh, we know that 20% of health is genetic. And then what does that mean for precision medicine? So it challenges that kind of thinking and asks for a much deeper engagement of the connection of our expressed biology to the context in which we live, and it also doesn't let people have an easy genetic out. Because actually, we all better be having genes expressing themselves, otherwise we'd be dead. So that's a very baseline approach. But it frames it that you can't just say, oh, or just easily dismiss, well, this group has different health status because it's genetically different, whatever that means. It's way more different and complicated. And sometimes people get concerned that complexity daunts, but actually complexity gives you that many more avenues of action.
next question. So I completely agree with your analysis of the, avoiding the fallacy of component causes adding up to 100%. I have a question about the what I think is misuse of PAFs, which is relates to my bugbear about the Global Burden of Disease Project, which, as you know, one of the most influential PAF exercises currently, and has been for the last 20 years. And I'm sure you agree with this, Nancy, that in calculating PAFs, the critical question is what do you calculate it over? And my critique of the GBD project is that they have deliberately gone after very proximate risk factor approach. So they calculate that mental health, depression followed by smoking, followed by hypertension, etc. The biggest causes of premature disability and days lost, which has completely, in my view, steered the investments of WHO, Gates Foundation, and other organizations in those areas. And I've yet to see a proper exercise on, let's say, the GBD caused by poverty, for example. I mean, I know they've made attempts, but not given on the same page as all the rest of the other PAFs. And I wonder what you have to say about how we can overcome that problem.
So I agree, and that gets back to how our causes even conceptualized and partitioned. And the examples that I gave are ones that actually start with the social determinants, as it were, as you would call them, and looks at what the differences are between people exposed and not exposed to those, and looks at what differences translate then for those PAFs. So nothing says that a PAF can be done only on a particular biological factor, although that may be interesting, and that to get a much fuller picture, you would need to go beyond this. And that's something that can be done and needs to be done, and needs to be taken up by people as a critique of that kind of approach. And again, do it without making anybody think that these are supposed to add up to 100% some way. And that what then becomes much more transparent is the way you're calling the question, Ichiro, calls the question in terms of what are the priorities and values at stake. If you want to start with biomedical factors, so-called, then that's what you'll get as your answers. If you want to start with social factors, you'll find out more about that. And you'll be drawing on different evidence to understand the causal pathways that are behind what comes out of the PAFs. But it's saying that nothing restricts PAFs to being on the biomedical risk factors the way that the GBD conceptualizes it. But your point also speaks to the importance of these kinds of exercises and the framing of causation within them to what happens around allocation of resources from the global level on through what we have in the US and other countries as well.
Roxanne Reddington-Wild from ABCD and also co-chair of the Health Disparities Action Network. I'm sort of struggling to frame this as an exact question, but your point that things don't add up to 100% and that factors mutually influence each other and reinforce, shift, et cetera, is something we've been wrestling with for a long while in trying to find sort of single action steps that if we change this social factor, such as access to education, will that actually resolve, well, poverty, since I work at Boston's Anti-Poverty Agency. Can you expand a bit on how one can conceptualize finding almost those domino points? Let me flick this domino, and a whole chain of things will occur.
So you're
positively.
asking, I take your question, and you're asking, and it's an important one, and so there's two different parts to look at that, though. So first, some of the framing that I'm doing is asking for the need for a historical understanding and a comparative understanding. So for example, I can say, let's think about Spain right now. You have an entire younger generation that got a lot of education and has about Zippo prospects of employment. So, because what's going on in their economy. So education doesn't automatically translate into better life. It depends on what's going on in the economy, and can you actually put that education to use? Or we're going to see some pretty interesting things happening with regard to if Brexit goes through, and what happens with people that are attaining degrees in the UK and then have actually much more limited possibilities for migration and lots of other things like that. So this is saying never assume there's a fixed effect or a fixed and also in what context. What has happened with regard, you can look for the different gains. For example, there's lots of research in the US that what you get back for a college degree is much greater if you're white than if you're black, for example. So you have to always, this is saying you have to contextualize. Second, it's saying that these are complex systems that we're dealing with. There may be some particular leverage points which are probably going to be determined much more politically than by the biology. So then you can think about, yes, there's something to be said for people that want to go for early childhood development, preschool, Head Start, et cetera, That is definitely an important thing. There will be others. And the point here is that there's not going to ever be one single magic bullet. And it's moving from that kind of thinking and saying, let's generate, in this case, let's generate a variety of PAF scenarios. Let's see what would happen if, making the comparison, the health status of those at a particular age, because you have to think life course, those who are at the best conditions, those in the worst conditions. What are the differences? How does that look in other places? It starts to give you a lens to do that. But I mean, science is never meant to give the easy answer, because that's not what it's about, but it is help give some rigorous evidence that people can then think about and then also make tactical decisions. And the other thing is that an epidemiologist should never design a policy. You work with people that are doing the political action, advocacy, and otherwise, but to think that epidemiologists are trained to A, understand policy, B, understand policy change, good luck.
David Rush, retired professor at Tufts. This is a very provocative presentation, and it's actually made me rethink some of the pitfalls of the work I've done in my life. I think there are two separate issues that you're dealing with. One is that every population we work with, even in experimental studies, is idiosyncratic in itself. And to generalize to the total human condition from such studies is really impossible. And it speaks to the issue of repetition and publication of negative results, because this is one that we suffer so often from publication, from bias due to the likelihood that positive results are going to get published and negative results aren't. But I think the two issues are idiosyncratic composition of every study population and the 100% issue. And I think one of the things you're telling us is that to be very skeptical about projections to second populations or subsequent populations from any small set of studies, and that many of the strategies we use now, which is to do giant studies once, may be much less practical, important, and valuable than doing lots of much smaller studies.
So to draw on your different points, and I do appreciate the questions you're asking. One, whatever study you do, it has to have enough people to have enough power to test your hypothesis, so you can't go too small. Secondly, at the same time, you do have to think about what is common and what is different amongst the different study populations that are involved. There are not just study populations. It's fascinating to me when I look in a lot of the genetic literature, they just say they have samples from people. It's like, where did they come from? Where do they live? What do they do? No, they just got samples from people somewhere. And that's not so great. And it's also not so great when you have serious selection bias. I actually think one of the biggest risks to most epidemiologic research is selection bias, who's in and who's out of the study. What does that have to do with the range of exposures and also the kinds of constellations of patterns of variation and correlation amongst the exposures and confounders or other kinds of covariates? So there are ways to think systematically about that, and that's why you need to have one of the parts of science, as you say, rightly so, is replication. Replication, however, in both the exact same kind of population to make sure you find the same thing again, but also in other kinds of populations. So there's work that's very explicitly on triangulation of methods, one of them being to try to test your question, the same hypothesis, in populations that you think will have different patterns of exposure and different patterns of confounder variation. And do you still get a robust effect? And that's got to be part of it. So you don't want to just have an endless repeat of the exact same experiment in the exact same population, although that can be helpful for ruling out fluke chance as well, since we always have to deal with chance in the results. But we can think systematically about that, and there's increasing work that's going on a separate note with regard to, for example, huge debates in our field and many others around causal inference, and there will be a special issue coming out in December of the International Journal of Epidemiology that has a series of paper on that, in which, among others, I and my colleague George Davies-Smith are arguing, and he's been writing much more about this, about the need for triangulation of methods to be able to address what you're saying, because populations are, on the one hand, idiosyncratic, but not totally. There are some things that are common to all people. As I said, everyone around the world, if you have too much carbon monoxide, you're dead. There are some things that are within the parameters of being the kind of biological species we are that needs a certain amount of oxygen going through our blood system, and especially to our brain. If we don't have it, that's it. So it's not like anything goes. So what's the range of what the variability is? What will that tell us? The debates that happen around the Women's Health Initiative, around who was exposed when, at what age to hormone therapy, what does that mean? The many wiggle rooms that some people are saying to still try to suggest that it could be an effective strategy, even though we know it causes increased risk of breast cancer around, and doesn't do as much as claimed around cardiovascular. That had to do in part with selection bias compared to who was studied before. So you always have to think very, very, very carefully who's in and who's out. There are arguments that were made for heading up the physician's health study and the nurse's health study that it made sense to look at them as restricted populations because it would rule out a lot of messy things. But the problem is that's the rest of us, the mess. And if we don't have studies that give us those data, we got a problem because we don't have the right range of exposure. That's what's behind the Hogben parable. If you study a population where every one of the million except for 4 kids is missing key vitamins, you're not going to understand the impact of missing vitamins on health.
Well, we're at time, but so please join me in thanking Dr. Nancy Krieger. And let's take a short break and then come back for the next panel. That's great. Thank you so much. That's great.
Hello. We're going to have the panel start, which is not on social network interventions. It's about housing, neighborhoods, and social mobility. And I'd like to remind everyone after this panel to please turn in their evaluation forms. And the first speaker on this panel is Dr. Teresa Asapuk, who is a social epidemiologist. And her research examines why place and social policy influence health and health disparities. Specifically, she examines the influence of racial residential segregation, neighborhood context, and policies outside the health sector, for example, those directly concerned with housing on neighborhoods, for their effects on racial, ethnic, and immigrant health disparities. Dr. Asapuk is currently the principal investigator of 3 NIH grants investigating how housing choice vouchers, the largest federal affordable housing policy in the US, and neighborhood context, influence the health of adolescents and their families. She also collaborates on other studies examining the impacts of place-based inequity on health and health disparities across the life course. Dr. Asapuk earned her master's and doctoral degrees from the Harvard School of Public Health and trained as a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar in Population Health at the University of Michigan. Dr. Asapuk is currently an associate professor in the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. Welcome, Dr. Asapuk.
I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. So today, I'm going to talk about residential mobility and health, using a housing experiment to inform how housing and neighborhood factors influence health and health equity. So if one looks across the US, there's remarkable variation in life expectancy at birth, as well as many other health outcomes across place. So this geographic variation is one of the motivating factors for my work. A baby girl born in 2013 has a life expectancy of 81 years on average at birth, but this varies substantially depending on the county she's born into. from a high of 85 and a half years in Marin, California, to a low of 71.5 in McDowell, West Virginia. So this is a 14-year life expectancy gap between the highest and lowest counties in the US. And it's hard to change life expectancy. So I'm going to frame for you how large this 14-year gap is. Here is a graph of life expectancy for both genders in the US since 1880. It took 65 years for us to obtain the last 14 years of life expectancy here. So it's been since 1944 since we've had a gap of 14 years. And not only place, but race plays a role in population health equity. So here you see that Black men and women lag behind the life expectancy of their white counterparts by 3.5 to 5.5 years in 2009, which puts Black Americans at the life expectancy that white Americans had about 30 to 40 years ago. So why do place and race matter for health? These are driving questions of mine. My work uses a geography of opportunity framework where opportunity is defined very simply as a situation placing an individual in a position to be more likely to succeed. And opportunity varies vastly across geography within a context of neighborhood-based and other place-based opportunities that shape people's lives. And there are consistently large racial ethnic disparities in access to areas of high opportunity. This is just one example of how opportunity varies across place, as seen in this opportunity map created by the Kirwan Institute for the Massachusetts Legislature in 2009 of the Boston metropolitan area. Kirwan created an index of neighborhood opportunity based on 19 different indicators across different domains of life and created quintiles. The lowest quintile neighborhoods are very low opportunity, and they're noted in whitish light yellow here in the central city of Boston. And you can see that suburban areas, or those surrounding, are more likely to be this darker red, which represents the highest quintile of opportunity. This well-established pattern of central city versus suburban patterns is replicated elsewhere in the nation. And although race is not included explicitly in any of these indicators, there is a very stark racial pattern of the distribution of racial populations across opportunity neighborhoods. So you can see here that over 90% of African Americans and Latinos live in the lowest 2 quintiles of neighborhood opportunity areas, compared to only 1/3 of whites. These opportunity patterns are one outcome of the strikingly large racial residential segregation in the US, which persists even today. This is 2010 data, and it depicts the New York metropolitan area, which is one of the most highly segregated areas in the US. It's also one of the most densely populated. And this is a map using census data. One dot represents 25 people, and the dots are color-coded by race ethnicity of where people live. It's not living with racial minority neighbors per se that is detrimental for minority health. It's the resources, opportunities, risks, and stressors that are associated with neighborhoods and different places. For instance, one main pathway is the quality of the neighborhood, living in much higher poverty neighborhoods or higher rates of crime. Another pathway is via socioeconomic attainment and structures that vary in different places, and another concerns healthcare quality. Racial residential segregation has therefore been deemed a fundamental cause of health disparities, and it has been linked with worse health among minorities for a variety of health outcomes. To change these health outcomes, it may be necessary to address these fundamental causes, like segregation, which seems like a monumental task. Okay, this is very daunting for anybody to think about, but as Len Syme has written, it doesn't take a revolution to change these things. Policy is changing every day, and we invest in continuing certain policies all the time. And many of these are social and economic policies. As Jim House's recent book, Beyond Obamacare, argues, policies outside the healthcare sector and health sector may be important levers for changing the social determinants of health and improving health, even if they're not intended to. And my work specifically focuses on housing affordability policies and how these policies can assist households to afford housing, which is their primary goal, income supplementation, and at the same time offer families a choice to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. So I'm going to focus my talk on one experiment using the Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly known as the Section 8 program, which is the largest federal investment in affordable housing in the US. The Moving to Opportunity study is a social experiment of voluntary neighborhood relocation conducted by the US Department of Health and Urban Development, Housing and Urban Development, among low-income families living in highly distressed public housing in 5 cities: Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, New York, and LA. The families are very disadvantaged at baseline. 72% were unemployed, 62% were on income support or receiving welfare at baseline. And the goal of this program was to disrupt the toxic effects of high neighborhood poverty on economic outcomes, like welfare reliance. A bit about the design. This was a randomized controlled trial where families were randomized to one of 3 treatment groups at baseline. The Section 8 group received a housing voucher, and they had no locational constraints on where they could use this voucher, and they used this voucher to supplement rental income in the private market to rent an apartment. So this is also called the traditional voucher group, or the unrestricted voucher group, or the Section 8 voucher group. The second group is the MTO experimental treatment group. This group also received a housing voucher to move out of public housing into private rental housing, and the voucher would subsidize their rent. But there was a locational requirement. The families had to move to neighborhoods with less than 10% of their neighbors in poverty. Because this was a constraint on where they could use the voucher, they also received housing counseling from local nonprofits to help them lease an apartment. The third group was the comparison group, the control group, and this was a group in public housing. They remained eligible to remain in public housing in these very high poverty neighborhoods, where the poverty rate was typically over 40%. Random assignment occurred in 1994 to 1997, so 2 decades ago. There were 2 program evaluations that were uniform across sites, one in 2002, 4 to 7 years after randomization, and the other was a longer-term evaluation, 10 to 15 years after random assignment in 2007, 2008. Although health was not originally included in the design or the logic model of this program, as a result of preliminary research, the investigators did include a range of physical and mental health outcomes on the surveys, primarily captured by surveys. So this is an opportunity to evaluate a social policy for its effects on health and conceivably health equity via housing and neighborhood pathways, potentially addressing racial residential segregation and the concentration of poverty. Since this is an experimental design, this study has high internal validity, and the policy also manipulated exposures to different neighborhood contexts that were patterned by this constraint to move to low poverty areas. So neighborhood poverty is a very conceptual piece of this design, and this informs the neighborhood etiology of health. We supplemented this design with causal methods such as instrumental variable analysis and causal mediation to strengthen some of our conclusions. The findings from this study are also policy relevant since housing vouchers constitute the largest US federal affordable housing program. Policymakers and advocates are very interested in the results of this program on different outcomes, and I'm particularly keen to show how this policy can be improved to benefit more low-income families. So I'm going to review a number of research questions today. and summarize findings by our team and others to address some of these questions. So the first question, is the Moving to Opportunity housing voucher treatment a cause of mental and physical health? And the short answer is yes. Here I'm going to show you the original investigator results that mental health was better at the final evaluation here among adult women and girls in the housing mobility treatment group compared to public housing controls for measures like psychological distress. So here the bars, the low poverty group is the group that was constrained to move to low poverty areas, and the Section 8 group was unconstrained compared to the control group. And these patterns of the increased better mental health for the voucher groups compared to the control groups is consistent across the short and the longer term evaluations among the mothers and the girls. MTO also affected physical health, but the findings were only present for adults, not for kids, and only for some of the physical health measures. So MTO did affect the BMI, obesity, and diabetes markers for the housing mobility treatment group to improve their health. As you can see here, these are findings from the long-term study. So MTO seems to be a cause of mental and physical health, but among whom? Here I'm going to focus on the adolescents for the most part, which has been the focus of my research. Note that for a number of these slides, we collapsed the low poverty and the Section 8 group into one voucher group to simplify analyses and improve parsimony because their effects were similar on adolescent health, which is an interesting phenomenon. I'm happy to talk about that more if you have questions about that. We and others found that there were no main effects of the MTO program on adolescent mental health when both genders were analyzed together, and that's because there was striking effect modification that was opposite by gender. So girls benefited from the MTO policy, but the boys were being harmed. So the girls' results here are below the x-axis, and these are results for several mental health outcomes: psychological distress, behavior problems, and past year major depressive disorder. And you can see that the adverse effects for boys are above this line. So the boys had higher risk of mental health problems if they were in one of the housing voucher groups. And this was the shocking finding. The housing policy advocates do not want to talk about this finding. We don't understand this finding, or haven't understood it very much. So to help, this was the motivating factor, because this is the largest affordable housing policy, to understand if we're harming boys, what can we do about it, and try to understand these patterns better. So to help understand these patterns, we sought to explore whether, first, all boys or whether some boys were harmed by this policy. So we tested whether a family's baseline health as a health-related vulnerability adversely modified the MTO treatment effect. And this is based on prior evidence that frailer subgroups may not benefit to the same extent from an intervention as healthier subgroups. And findings for subgroups have policy implications for enhancing the program design. So here is what we found, that health-related vulnerability of a family does adversely modify the treatment effects. So here we have two different modifiers at baseline, a family's health-related developmental and health indicators, and then violent crime victimization was a separate indicator, and these are not correlated in the data. So we found that it wasn't all boys who were harmed. Here's a gradient you see by gender and by the baseline health vulnerability. And you see here that only the boys whose families had health vulnerabilities were harmed by the policy. If boys were from healthier families or were healthier themselves, they had no effect of the policy, statistically. Girls who came from families without health vulnerabilities were the only subgroup to benefit from the policy, and girls who came from families with health vulnerabilities had no effects of the policy. So this helps explain some of the patterns that health vulnerability is an important piece of who is being affected by the policy. In a paper published earlier this year in American Journal of Public Health, led by my colleague Quinn Nguyen, we used machine learning methods to test for effect modification by other factors in the MTO for treatment effects on adolescent mental health. Now, machine learning methods are rather new in public health. They haven't been applied very much. And in the randomized controlled trial literature, you see that most trials test whether treatment effects on a health outcome are modified by baseline characteristics by modeling interactions between treatment and baseline variables one at a time. But trials are underpowered to test, often they're underpowered to test any interactions, and this is putting aside the issue of post hoc testing. But they're typically underpowered to detect higher order interactions specifically. And there may be subgroups that are more vulnerable to treatment effects that are defined by several variables simultaneously. So we used recursive partitioning to create classification trees that identify modifiers that best differentiate the largest differences in the treatment effect on mental health. So the largest differences between the treatment group and the control group on mental health. And then to improve robustness, we then used replication or resampling methods among subsamples of the data, 10 subsamples of the data. And to our knowledge, we're the first to apply this method to identify effect modification in randomized controlled trials. So we identified several subgroups that experienced heterogeneous effects here. And here's the classification tree. Essentially, it's interpreted visually as this is the first break in the data, meaning this variable, which you can't read very well here, but this is the Chicago site. So this means that when you look at the treatment effects on adolescent mental health, we're looking at psychological distress here, that the largest differences we saw were by whether the adolescent lived in Chicago or they lived in one of the other 4 cities. Okay, those were the largest effects. And those kids that did live in Chicago didn't have any effect of the policy here. But the kids that did not live in Chicago, and then the next break in the data after that is gender. So boys that lived in outside of Chicago had harmful effects. So this tree, you can visualize that these subgroups are created from the breaks in the data from the variables that are up above. So we identified that there were 2 subgroups that were harmed, and then a group that benefited based on these 4 variables of site, gender, baseline behavioral and health problems related to schooling, as well as having a teenage mother. In replication analyses, gender, age, and the site, as well as the child's developmental health at baseline, consistently emerged as the strongest effect modifiers of MTO on mental health. And here is a map of the replication analyses that we did. So both machine learning methods and traditional methods point to the treatment heterogeneity of MTO on health outcomes. So why the opposite effects by gender? So this is one of the objectives of our grants, this striking gender difference, and it's particularly disturbing given this is a large policy that's ongoing. Some qualitative work suggests that the environment related to sexual harassment and sexual violence improved substantially when girls moved out of high poverty areas. They were no longer being preyed upon by the older boys and men in their neighborhoods sexually. And this is a particularly relevant factor for girls, less relevant for boys, we believe. So the qualitative work suggests that the disruption in social networks that boys experienced was more harmful for them, and connections to mentors and fathers. And some evidence suggests that boys are less adaptable to such change. And this the socialization that boys learn to survive in high poverty areas and adapt and survive may have been maladaptive when they moved to lower poverty areas. So we're still researching these mechanisms. The next question, are there sensitive periods when the moving to opportunity effects, when kids moved, are there sensitive periods when MTO was more influential on health? So here we're testing some life course hypotheses. We know that adolescence is an important period of dramatic biological, psychological, and social change that shape health. And our research by my colleague Nicole Schmidt is finding that when kids were older at baseline, particularly over the age of 9, the effects of the MTO program are more magnified. And the magnification of these effects is then built on the gender effects, where the MTO is harmful for boys and beneficial for girls for these outcomes. So here we're examining risky substance use behavior, and the patterns of substance use roughly mirror that of mental health. So the findings here for boys are showing, for boys that are 9 or older, they had adverse treatment effects, and the treatment effects are more harmful the older the boy was at random assignment. Okay, so we're measuring a 4 to 7 year difference between random assignment and the outcome, but here we're just looking at how old the boy was at baseline. For girls, the overall effect of MTO on this risky substance use measure is beneficial overall, and then as girls get older, as girls were older at baseline, for each additional year they were older at baseline, the effect of the program was more beneficial. The next question, did MTO change families' exposure to neighborhood quality? So here, by design, participants in the low poverty treatment arm of the MTO were expected to move to substantially lower poverty neighborhoods by virtue of the constraint that was put on where they could use their vouchers in the voucher group compared to the other treatment arms. And the research has found that, yes, MTO did substantially change the neighborhoods that these experimental voucher families lived in. So here's a box plot, and neighborhood poverty is on the y-axis. The low poverty voucher group box plot is substantially lower than controls. The Section 8 voucher group didn't move on average to the better neighborhoods that the low poverty group did. You can see the large variability in where the low poverty group moved to, and then a number of them, about half of them actually didn't use the voucher. So there was a lot of non-compliance in this group that explains the larger variability here. The non-compliance was lower, or the compliance was higher in the Section 8 group who used the vouchers. Okay, so this is 1 year after random assignment, the box plot comparison. 5 years after random assignment, you see that the groups are converging more. 10 years since random assignment, the groups are converging more, but still 10 years after random assignment, you still see that the low poverty and Section 8 groups, they are not statistically significant from each other, but they are still significantly in better poverty neighborhoods than the control group. So this to me is a striking finding that even 10 years after this one voucher assignment, and the families were required to stay in that unit for a year before they could move somewhere else. But other than that, there were a few requirements. They had to remain eligible for the program, for the Section 8 program. But other than that, there was no additional treatment that was provided within that 10-year window. So the next question, did the MTO treatment improve other aspects of the neighborhood environment besides lowering neighborhood poverty? So in research led by Quinn Wynn, our team probed the patterns of neighborhood quality that were achieved by the MTO families. So did the MTO treatment improve other measures? To answer this question, we pieced together a quilt of data to evaluate neighborhood outcomes from administrative data, from subjective data, self-report data collected by survey of the MTO participants, as well as from independent population-based neighborhood studies, surveys, to generate neighborhood-level measures of social environment. And we found that families in the voucher groups experienced substantial improvements in neighborhood conditions across most measures compared to the public housing control group, including economic conditions, collective efficacy, violent crime rates, and neighborhood disorder. And this wasn't a surprise to us. We know that a lot of these neighborhood factors were correlated and are correlated. The second question, did families in the regular Section 8 voucher group experience improvements in neighborhood environment of the same magnitude as those in the Section 8 group? So did the two voucher groups achieve approximately equal attainment? And the answer is no. For the most part, the low poverty voucher group achieved better neighborhood attainment compared to Section 8. And you can see that there was convergence over time. But across the multiple dimensions that we examined, we saw differences by voucher group. Third, was there site variation and improvements in neighborhood conditions across the 5 MTO cities? The answer is yes. This site variation has not been examined very much in MTO, but there were 5 different cities with very different contexts, very different housing markets, different population compositions, and different rental markets where people were trying to lease up. Site effects are very common in social experiments and in multi-site trials, but the original investigators made the choice not to present site effects. So we don't know very much about them. What we found, site effects on neighborhood quality were largest for New York and Los Angeles. So the treatment control differences were larger in these cities. The heterogeneity across the 5 cities was particularly large for administrative measures compared to subjective report measures. And these site-specific effects suggest that neighborhood inequality is very context-specific. And our team is looking into whether, to try to rule out some of the reasons we might see this site heterogeneity. For instance, is it about population composition? So here are some of the MTO effects on neighborhood outcomes. This is violent crime by site and by voucher group, comparing the low, for instance, this is the Los Angeles low poverty treatment group compared to controls. So all of the sites saw reductions in violent crime when the families moved from public housing in high poverty areas to lower poverty neighborhoods. And you can see that the effects were largest for LA and New York. And here we derived neighborhood level measures of collective efficacy, as well as its component scales by site, derived from population-based surveys linked to the Moving to Opportunity study. So we linked neighborhood level measures from independent data to the MTO data, and we saw improvements in collective efficacy. We only had the data for 3 of the 5 sites, but here you see in Boston, for example, an improvement in collective efficacy for the experimental group compared to controls in the low poverty group, as well as the Section 8 group, which is approximately equal. And you can see larger effects for the experimental groups. The low poverty groups that were forced to move to the low poverty areas had the largest effects. And these effects maintain when you look at, when you examine just those who move, adjusting for non-compliance. So why did the MTO influence health? And in this vein of our research, we're examining mechanisms. So we've examined several different health outcomes in the MTO study, and we have several others that are ongoing, all using the interim data to date. We do not yet have access to the final data. In these analyses, we're applying newly developed weight-based causal mediation methods. And these methods improve on traditional mediation analysis. That's very common in the social sciences and epidemiology. And it improves on those methods in certain circumstances, like when you have a nonlinear outcome, when you have multiple mediators and you're trying to estimate their effects, or in the situation where the mediator is also a modifier of the exposure on the outcome. So in the first mediation paper that we published in SSM, we focused on adolescent asthma, and MTO had actually an adverse effect on asthma among adolescents and kids. And we searched for a number of mediators, and it was a very disappointing paper because we found no mediators that mediated in the expected direction of the variables that we examined. We did find some countervailing gender-specific mediation, meaning that when we accounted for variables like smoking and housing quality among the girls, the effects of the MTO program were more negative on asthma than before adjusting for that. But it was not a very satisfying finding. Nonetheless, it's what we found empirically. In a paper we published last year in AJE, we documented that census-based economic dimensions of neighborhood partially mediated the MTO effect on adult BMI and obesity. And economic deprivation is closely tied to neighborhood poverty. We derived this from a factor analysis of different census measures, and it included neighborhood poverty. So this is an expected effect that economic deprivation was the main dimension of census-based measures of neighborhood quality that partially mediated this effect. We have some other mediation analyses that we're also taking on currently as well. So a housing mobility treatment has the potential to improve health among participants in the medium term and short term. These programs had few explicit health-related supports for participants, yet there were health improvements in addition to some harms. Effects on health are operating via the key social determinants of health that can be manipulated in the housing market with this type of study. We found that baseline health, gender, and age were also very influential in patterning whether adolescents exhibited health returns as a result of MTO. And vulnerability plays a role in all these factors. These factors are understudied, however, in the neighborhood health effects literature. There's not a lot of focus on effect heterogeneity. But developmental literature suggests that the contingency of health effects by social context is important and present and necessary for examining. Importantly, these results suggest that if we supplement housing mobility policies with other services, perhaps health-related services, substance use services, or services changing other social determinants of health like education and working with schools, things that can counteract these baseline health vulnerabilities, for example, health effects may be enhanced. So in conclusion, high racial residential segregation is a central feature of urban inequality in America, and we must address it. Neighborhood context clearly causes mental and physical health, and we see this among this very disadvantaged sample using this experimental design of housing vouchers. Social determinants of health by place matter for health and health equity, and I didn't show you the range of different health determinants or social determinants that vary by race, vary by place, but it's very striking. So addressing these social determinants is an important piece of this. Social policies are necessary to change the social determinants of health and may affect health even if they're not intended to. And this is one example of a translational social epidemiology research project. This policy improves affordability of housing by addressing income. So it's an income policy, as well as, and at the same time, it also broadens families' choice to move to higher opportunity areas. And this is an aspect of the policy. There are housing mobility policies that provide more services to help people move to different places if they want to. And this is a growing part of this housing voucher policy. So I've focused on this affordable housing policy that is a voucher-based rental subsidy. But this doesn't mean that we should not revitalize and improve neighborhoods. We certainly should. And the leading policy experts and researchers have stated that we need to address multiple strategies for addressing the concentration of poverty, racial segregation, and neighborhood-based inequality. But the Housing Choice Voucher Program remains underfunded compared to demand. The waiting lists are sometimes years long. This policy is not funded nearly what it needs to be, what it could be funded at. The MTO project was a $70 million governmental investment, and health researchers have had limited access to this data from the experiment. But we must understand all we can from this policy, since it's a major existing housing policy. It has been harming boys, and since it has the potential to influence population health and promote health equity. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators and my funding sources, primarily from NIH, for this work, and thank you so much for your time today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Osbrook, for the wonderful talk. It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Athinder Venkateramani. He's an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital, where he serves as a primary care physician and investigator. He's also a faculty affiliate at Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies. Dr. Venkateramani received his medical degree from Washington University School of Medicine and his PhD in health economics from Yale University. He completed his residency in internal medicine global primary care track at Mass Gen Hospital. Dr. Venkateramani's research uses insights from economics, demography, and medicine to elucidate how experiences in early childhood and early adulthood influence the long-run health and economic outcomes. He's particularly interested in how social policies and health interventions influence both health and socioeconomic inequality. He currently has projects that are situated in the United States, Uganda, South Africa, and Mexico.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about what is a new research agenda for us, actually. And I'd just like to acknowledge my team first. There's a lot of people behind this research, including Dr. Kawachi. And some of this research was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Hilton Society Scholars Program to Dr. Alex Tsai, who was the PI on that grant. Okay, so I'd like to frame my talk in terms of the American dream, and this is something we're hearing a lot about in this particular election cycle. And here are two sort of academic treatments of the American dream, one by Raj Chetty, the other by Robert Putnam. But the idea of the American dream is that one's life chances are not contingent on their background. So upward mobility is not defined by where you start. In other words, equality of economic opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, how it's measured, and why it might be important for health. We actually heard a lot about that just now, so I might be able to economize on time there. Then I'll give you some evidence as to how these new measures of economic mobility actually correlate with health, and I'll try to argue that that's a causal relationship. And then I'll try to tie economic opportunity to the recent American mortality crisis, which I'll tell you more about. So what is economic opportunity? And it's basically the prospects for upward social mobility through the life course. And that can be defined in any way. It can be income, it can be education. I'd like to point out that it's distinct from income inequality, and the reason is income inequality is sort of the distribution of resources at a given point in time, whereas economic opportunity talks about the trajectory of people to rise in the income distribution. Of course, the two things are related, and there's actually like a curve that shows that positive relationship. I think it's called the Great Gatsby curve. So the two things do run together, but they're not the same. And so how do we measure it? There are two ways you can think about it. One is this idea of relative mobility, meaning what is the correlation between a group of children, their income, and the income of their parents. And what that'll give you is an intergenerational income elasticity, and the higher that number is, the less mobility there is. Another way to measure it is absolute mobility, which is basically looking at, for parents who are in a particular part of the income distribution, and for children born to those parents, how high in the income distribution can they rise, conditional on where they started. So that's more of an absolute mobility measure. And the important thing about all of these sort of intergenerational mobility measures is that they've already happened, right? So if you're able to calculate this, it's because these outcomes have realized in both populations, the parents and the children. So at some level, we're looking at retrospective measures, and you should just remember that as I go through the rest of the talk. This Kerban index that you pointed out actually is something new that I've seen that may contain measures of, I guess, early childhood spending or health that could actually prospectively predict economic opportunity, but the science on exactly what causes economic opportunity is still, I think, being elucidated as we go, by you in part, with your housing work. So recently, in the last 2 years, there's been, I think, a very profound revolution in the measurement of economic opportunity in the United States at very local levels. So Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren, Raj Chetty is now at Stanford, use income tax data on people from my birth cohort and a few around my birth cohorts, and the income tax returns of our parents, and basically assigned a county based on where, say, my dad first claimed me as a dependent. So that would have been in Saratoga County, New York. And using that data, which is 10 million observations, they derive these absolute and relative mobility statistics for every county in the United States. And so what you see is a map of their data showing the average rank of a child born in the bottom 25th percentile of parents, where they were in the expectation where they ended up in each county. And as you can see, there's a very strong geographic pattern to economic opportunity, which looks a lot like the geographic patterns you might see for life expectancy and a number of other social factors. So how could opportunity affect health? And so I started along this line of thinking because of that first arrow. So I'm a primary care doctor, and I had a patient who, towards the end of my residency, he was in my resident clinic. I'd followed him for 4 years. And I was feeling reflective, and I was asking him, we've talked about quitting smoking every time you've come in, but we haven't been able to get there. What can I do differently? And this is in Charlestown, Massachusetts, which you might know is one of the epicenters of the opiate epidemic right now. And what he said to me was, what's the point in trying to quit smoking? I'm never going to get out of where I am right now. And so if you think about it, going back to graduate school, you can conceptualize that in Michael Grossman's 1972 economic model of investments in health. And the idea is that if you're not able to attain a higher paying job or employment opportunity that will allow you to ascend in the economic ladder, then what's the marginal return to a health investment might actually be lower. But if you can take advantage of those opportunities, you might invest more. That's the economist in me talking, and that's where I started with all of this. Another side of this, though, is hope and aspirations, and that comes from the psychology literature. And I'm finding more and more with my patients that this probably matters more, because normal humans don't really think like economists, I'm learning. So the idea is this: if economic opportunity is depressed, that can also depress people's hope and their ultimate dreams of where they want to go, and that changes expectations. You see a lot of this in the literature on adolescents in inner cities who are living in very violent settings. They have fatalistic expectations of where their lives are going to go, and as a result, they change their behavior. So this, in some sense, you can think about it with that conceptualization. Another thing you could put up here, which I learned after yesterday, is stress. So living in a low opportunity area can be stressful for a number of reasons. Very, very high opportunity can be stressful too. So you see kids who are at the sort of extremes of academic performance getting into certain kinds of stimulants. All of that is part of this as well. So there could be a nonlinearity. It's not just too much economic opportunity could be stifling for some people. And lastly, we talked a lot about socioeconomic status, access to health resources, and what those things do for health behaviors and physical and mental health, and economic opportunity. They're along the causal chain that might link economic opportunity to health outcomes. So I'm going to start with some cross-sectional evidence. The data that Raj Chetty put together is cross-sectional, so that was the natural place to start. Before I get into that, I'll flag that in 2010-2011, in studies of Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans, there were researchers that found a link between individual perceptions of economic opportunity and self-reported health. So what we wanted to do was build on that and look nationally. So we started by looking at mortality at the county level. There are a number of problems with doing things at aggregates, but that's where we started. And so this is using basically data from the CDC Wonder. This is all-cause mortality. Each of those gray dots is a county. And the black line is the non-parametric relationship between average upward mobility in that county, which was from that map I showed you earlier, and deaths per 100,000 people, age adjusted. And so what you basically see is a monotonic negative slope in that relationship. So counties with higher opportunity are places that have reduced deaths per 100,000 people. Of course, opportunity is going to be correlated with many, many other things. That's what that map that I showed you could look like any map of any social indicator that you might want to draw. So we actually went ahead and adjusted for a lot of them. So income inequality, income per capita, social capital, racial and income segregation, level of education, county demographic characteristics, violent crime. So we actually threw them all in the model. And that's probably not a good statistical practice because one could argue you may even over-control for things. But my job actually was to try and kill the association in whatever way I can because I thought I'd learn something from doing that. But I wasn't actually able to. That association remained robust. So what I found, or what we found, was that mortality was about 17% higher in these lower in these high opportunity counties than they were in the low opportunity counties, and the number of deaths that were attributable was around 150,000. And we looked at the risk factors, and we saw a similar relationship there. So just to flag two quick things, this is a table from the paper. The relationship between economic opportunity and mortality differed by race in a way that I still don't understand, but that coefficient was larger for African Americans, potentially having to do with sort of a long history of discrimination and a lack of opportunity, but also in conflict with recent evidence from the Gallup poll showing that potentially minority populations are more optimistic about the future than whites, at least in the last 2 years. The other thing I wanted to show you is that you don't see this relationship for people above the age of 65, and that is as it should be. We sort of treat it as a falsification test. The idea is they're already retired, so they're not prospectively thinking about their employment opportunities. And also the economic opportunity data was not measured based on these cohorts. So we felt pretty good about that. The next step we did was to look at individual level health outcomes. The exposure is still at the county. We still control for many of the same things, but here we're able to look for morbidity. And so these are just maps that, actually I can't tell how great they look up there, but basically it's a spatial distribution of economic opportunity. Red is less, orange and yellow is more, and the same with, this is general self-reported health. But basically, if you look at the days of poor health reported in the last 30 days, people living in these high opportunity counties report about 20% fewer days, even after conditioning on all of these, the covariates that I mentioned. And the interesting thing with that number is that that's actually about a fourth of the association between having a college degree at the individual level and these health outcomes. So if you're thinking about a diffuse, potentially poorly measured county level factor having an association that is about a fourth as strong as one of the most stable and most powerful social determinants of health we know, then it's something to start paying attention to. So the problem with, obviously, with cross-sectional stuff is, you have one point in time. There's possible confounding both statically and dynamically. At the aggregate level, you run into issues with ecologic fallacy potentially. We tried to do lots of econometric things that are becoming in vogue now for people who are doing cross-sectional analysis. It passed all of those things, but we thought natural experiments would be a next place to go. And economists love natural experiments because you get at this causality question, but I like them more because you can actually look at specific policy. So if your natural experiment is a policy that exists out there, you have a chance to evaluate it, as well as to say something about the causal link that you're interested in scientifically. So we started to look at affirmative action bans. So what happened was, 10 states had passed bans basically disallowing the use of race in consideration of admissions at state universities. And this happened between 1996 and about 2007. So affirmative action bans can affect health behaviors in a couple ways. One is the pathway we talked about before, is if you're telling people, hey, here's a potential ceiling on your efforts and your upward mobility, it might actually reduce their desire to invest in their own health because of perceived lower returns. The other possibility is that it reduces hope and aspirations. It can also create defiance. We're going to be looking at teenagers, so that's important. And it also increases competition for college slots that are available, which could potentially induce people to behave more healthily, but it could also go the other way. So what we're going to do is look at, in a quasi-experimental setup, look at health behaviors among underrepresented minorities in states that passed bans versus those that did not, and look before and after. And just to sort of show you that these bans were salient, this is like, I guess we didn't have Google Trends back in the 90s, but this is looking at LexisNexis for state news mentions of affirmative action bans, and the vertical line is the time of the policy. And basically what you see is the year before the policy and the year of, there are a lot of news mentions, and it kind of trails off after that. So just to argue that it might be salient and people are actually paying attention to these things, it's not just some quiet legislative action going on. So what we found actually was very interesting. Affirmative action bans led to increases in both smoking and alcohol use among teenagers. This is, we're looking at 15 to 18-year-olds. And it's about 20% of the means, the pre-program means for both. Most of these impacts are among kids who are age 17 and 18, the kind of people who are thinking about college, or it's more proximal to them. And if you look at non-underrepresented minority students, you see no impact at all. And this is just an event study where the hash line is sort of the year the policy went into effect, and basically you see that alcohol use and smoking both jump. You draw the event study for white students, and you don't see that at all. So just to finish up, I'm going to tie this economic opportunity issue with the recent mortality crisis that we're seeing. And we had actually started working on this, and then about 6 months later, Ann Case and Angus Deaton wrote a paper showing some potentially alarming trends in mortality rates among white middle-aged Americans. And these seem to be particularly driven by suicides, poisoning from alcohol, opiates, and just general drug use, so overdoses. I know people have been debating about whether these trends are real. There's like a back and forth with Andrew Gelman, but for sure they've at least remained stagnant and are not following the secular decline in mortality that pretty much every other population group in the US has seen. So, sorry about that, but basically one of the things they wrote in their paper, which is why we turned our eye to this, is that they hypothesized that this might be happening because of despair from the fact that people didn't actually rise up and attain a living standard beyond that of their parents. And so we thought, was this a failure to realize the American dream? Is this what is driving it? So we started by looking at suicide in the cross-section. These are unpublished results. And if you read The Atlantic pretty much every month, there's an article about linking income inequality to the recent suicide epidemic that we're seeing. So what we did was look at, using all the same covariates we talked about before, we just looked in the cross-section. Is there an association between income inequality and suicide? There is. But it looks like the driver might actually be this economic opportunity measure. Once we include that, we can actually bring that coefficient on the Gini coefficient down to 0. The next thing we did was we looked at changes in mortality. Where are the areas where white middle-aged mortality is stagnant or growing? And we were able to control for time-invariant county-level factors and just look at changes. And it turns out that even after you account for adult poverty, employment, income inequality, or education, those changes, the places where mortality was either stagnant or growing were the places that had originally started out as being areas where social mobility was low. And so it's very surprising because employment trends and income inequality were basically following these mobility trends too, but we were able to parse them apart. And the salience of economic opportunity is really interesting. There was a Gallup analysis last month by an economist employed by that organization that looked at support for our protest candidate, Donald Trump, and found that even after you condition on income inequality, trade-related changes in jobs, poverty rates, the two most important factors that explain Trump's support in the cross-section were this economic opportunity measure and life expectancy. So we think that we're triangulating on some salience of this topic, which has become more and more important over the last decade in the US. So lastly, I just wanted to give you this is also more recent evidence. I think I made this graph on Friday, so it's pretty new. But where is opportunity going for white middle-aged Americans? So part of the thought that is it's related to trade. So there was a paper by Pierce and Schott, which is a working paper. These are two guys at the Federal Reserve, who show that areas where the penetration of trade from China basically led to the loss of jobs, and that was an David Autor paper from 2013 in the American Economic Review, had greater deaths from opiates, suicide, and liver poisoning, so end-stage liver disease. So one of the things that's interesting is sectoral change and the loss of opportunities is a process that has been going on now for 20, 30 years or more. I'm not the kind of economist who knows how to create jobs, but I'd like to be the kind of economist who understands how can we create policies that buffer people from that sectoral change. So if you look at this graph, we have two lines here. One is, the black line is the relationship between the changes in mortality and exposure to trade. It's a positive line in areas where unemployment benefits were actually below the median of all US states. But if you look at the states above the median, which is the gray line, that line is almost flat. And this calls to work that David Stuckler and others have did in the UK, looking at the effect of social policies on health outcomes during very dramatic, deep recessions. But this looks at more of what happens as we have this slow brewing sectoral change. What can we do for people who are being left behind? So we want to go there next. So we're going to keep looking at different policies that affect opportunity. We're looking at an immigration policy now, and early results from that show that there's positive effects on mental health among people who were exposed to it. We're looking at the Rust Belt as a case study of this trade-related decline in jobs, and how does that change the perceptions of young people, their opportunities, and their ultimate health behaviors. So that's a big data set we're building, and we'd love to work with you all if you're interested. We're interested in understanding more about hope and aspirations. That's some work I'm doing in Uganda, which is actually qualitative. And I'm learning a lot. I've never done a qualitative study as an economist, but it's pretty awesome. So stay tuned on that. And also the interactions between these county-level social determinants. I mean, here's a graph looking at the relationship between income and the proportion reporting that they're in good health. This is just in the current population survey. The line at the bottom, which I think is purple and colorblind, but that line is the usual line you see, right? There's an increasing sort of asymptotic relationship. But then if you look but that's in low opportunity counties. If you look at the high opportunity counties, which is the orange line, that relationship is almost flat. And that's after controlling for the interaction between household income and all the other social county level determinants that I had mentioned before. So this is what remains. So there's this pretty strong flattening effect, and we'd love to learn more about that. And that kind of gets at the whole interface between societal change, perceptions of opportunity, and public sector programs, and how these can interact to best buffer people against worsening health, or I think more preferentially improving their health altogether. So thanks so much. I'd love to talk more about this if you guys are interested.
Hello. I have the pleasure of introducing our final speaker of the conference, Dr. Mariana Arcaya. Mariana Arcaya is a social epidemiologist and an urban planner whose work explores the dynamic relationship between geographic contexts, particularly neighborhoods, and health. I've had the pleasure to work with Mariana over the past 3 years and observe as she's transitioned from a Yerby postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies to an assistant professor at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. It's been an absolute joy to TA her class as she takes on the difficult task of helping architects and planners understand a social epidemiologic perspective on population health. She teaches with such passion for addressing health inequity, an absolutely incredible breadth of knowledge, an ability to communicate across disciplines, and PowerPoint slides that have the occasional picture of her adorable child, Max. Dr. Arcaya works on a variety and array of interdisciplinary projects and is deeply involved with addressing the health challenges of communities in the Boston area and across the state. Whether that's through community-based participatory research examining the health effects of development and gentrification on low-income residents, sitting on committees attempting to address the state's opioid epidemic, or assessing the health impacts of changing rates and services for the T, our local train system. In addition to her impressive publication list and research portfolio, and her willingness to push the field in innovative methodological directions, Dr. Arcaya is also an incredibly supportive mentor and student advocate. Today she'll be discussing her work on foreclosure and health, work that I believe she began while she was a doctoral student at the Chan School of Public Health. So please join me in welcoming the final speaker for the day, Dr. Mariana Arcaya.
Hi, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for all of you for staying with us here today. So I'm going to be talking about home mortgage foreclosure and its effect on population health. And so what I want to do is start out by showing a handful of images from around the country over the past 8 years or so, including starting with this pair of foreclosed homes in Detroit from 2008, or this foreclosure in Detroit in 2015, after the housing market recovered. Or this foreclosed home in Northern California from 2014. And as I kind of flip through these images, what I'm hoping that you'll notice are the varieties of housing types that can be affected by foreclosure, from detached single-family homes, triple-deckers, apartments, the different types of neighborhoods that have been affected by foreclosure, not just urban contexts, not just the Sun Belt, not just the Rust Belt, suburban subdivisions, and also the different types of hazards or nuisances that foreclosed properties impose on their neighbors. So for example, this is a picture of a home in Killeen, Texas in 2014, and the story here is that the family in the home, where the garage looks sort of intimidatingly imposing and blank, had been foreclosed upon and evicted, and they hadn't moved out by the eviction date. So all of their stuff was thrown onto the sidewalk, which is typical in these types of proceedings, and it's really humiliating for folks. And then ostensibly they gathered up what they could and left behind the rest, and then the neighbors actually posted this photo online and said, well, now it's been a couple weeks, and whose problem is this? And this doesn't exactly look like the type of neighborhood that is going to feel kindly on this type of presentation on the sidewalk. Or these types of homes. This is a picture from Florida in 2014, where the home in the middle is a bank-owned foreclosure, and I'm showing this to talk about the fact that actually in some warm climates, one of the big problems with foreclosed abandoned homes has actually been pests, and some of these homes will sit abandoned for a year, 2 years, and the neighbors will say, I've noticed an increase in the number of bees. And when someone goes in, sometimes the entire top floor of the house is one giant nest. Here's a home in Northern California in 2008, and this is actually a film student who posted photos of herself filming a movie for school on the site of this abandoned property. I'm assuming it was a horror film. But the abandoned homes with swimming pools have actually been associated with a rise in West Nile virus incidents. So these have been implicated in spikes in West Nile virus. Other types of hazards these homes impose on neighbors include the social tension that goes along with the transitions and the eviction. So this is an interesting case. This is in Minneapolis in 2012. A family was foreclosed on, and the Occupy movement said, we're going to occupy this home. This is not an uncommon thing. And there was a 3-day standoff with police in the middle of what looks to be an otherwise leafy neighborhood, a 3-day standoff with police. 3 people were arrested, and this involved PNC Bank, Freddie Mac, the homeowners, and Occupy protesters. Likewise, this is also a bank-owned foreclosed home in Massachusetts. So again, not just the Sun Belt, not just the Rust Belt, not just the city, not just new suburban subdivisions, also well-established older suburbs. And here's an image from East New York in 2011. It's not just weak market cities, it's also strong market cities. This is New York City. And so while I've shown a few examples of the 9.4 million homes that were forfeited as part of the foreclosure crisis between 2007 and the present day, I also wanted to highlight sort of a broader macro level view of the phenomenon. And what we have here is actually on the x-axis are quarters. So these aren't years, these are quarters of years starting in 2005 going up to 2015. And on the y-axis we have the number of foreclosure auctions scheduled. And so, the way to read this is in the middle of 2010, every quarter 160,000 homes foreclosure auctions were scheduled to sell those homes, many of which were reverted to bank ownership. So, between sort of this macro level view where you can see here, we had a real run up to what we called the housing crisis, and now things have recovered, but the recovery has left us in a worse place than we started, and the recovery has been quite uneven. So between this and the images I showed, I think that the take-home messages I wanted to sort of lead with are three facts, right? So the home mortgage foreclosure crisis was not, the problems were not randomly distributed, but very few types of neighborhoods, homes, families were completely spared. That's the first take-home message. The second is that the housing market recovery is not complete. It's very uneven, and there are still many parts of this country where over 20% of the homes are in negative equity. And third, that there's a range of nuisance and conditions that go along with the foreclosure process, and that we're still kind of coming out of this. And in this past year alone, I think the estimate is that 670,000 homes were forfeited in foreclosure still. So it's sort of an ongoing crisis. So public health and medical researchers have taken note of this phenomenon. This is just a simple Scopus search that I put together. And what you can see is that there were no papers written on the health effects of foreclosure until 2008, when there were 2 papers published. I believe one of them was a commentary, it wasn't empirical. And now we're at the point where there's about 40 to 45 studies on the health effects of foreclosure, depending on what you count as a health effect, and 2 systematic reviews of this literature, which I will talk about. But in order to understand or make any sense of this literature, you actually have to know something about foreclosure. And fortunately for us, there's a lot of people who have claims to have simplified the process for the audience to understand, how simple it is to walk through the foreclosure process. These are actually some of my favorites because they are some of the simpler models you can find. I decided to make my own for the purposes of this talk, since I'm in a health audience, not a planning audience. So how does foreclosure work? So the first thing that happens is, you've taken out a loan on a home, you fall behind on your payments, and you are going to eventually get a letter from your mortgage company that you have defaulted on your mortgage loan, and you need to become current on your payments. If you don't do that, you'll get they're going to send a notice of sale saying you've been behind for more than 3 months. We told you you were behind. We're going to sell your home. And when this happens, they have to post the sale in a newspaper. They have to put signs up on and around the property. And there's a lot of visual cues that a home is going to be auctioned. The home is auctioned. Foreclosure auction also will be referred to as a trustee sale. This varies by whether you're in a judicial or non-judicial foreclosure state. But typically, the asking price for the home is the amount that's due on the mortgage plus any fees that are owed. And then after the auction, somebody will either a third-party buyer, an investor, or a family who says, I want to, do a foreclosure sale because I'll get a good deal. That's called a third-party buyer, and they'll buy the home and they'll move in or rehab it and move in. Or nobody makes an offer that's high enough, and the ownership reverts to the bank. And this is called real estate-owned foreclosures. And these are typically vacant properties. And what happens is after the bank repossesses ownership of the home, the first thing they do is hire a property management company to secure the property. So board it up until they figure out what to do with it, essentially. And this is complicated by the fact that there are several ways to exit this process. So really at any point before the auction, you can either make a payment to get out of this process. You can conduct what's called a short sale. So you can say, I don't want this on my record, and I'm gonna sell my home for less than what I would if I wasn't under pressure, but enough to pay off my mortgage. Or you can voluntarily transfer the deed of your home to the bank, deed in lieu of foreclosure. And the benefit of this is that you don't have a foreclosure on your credit score. And so what happens when we think about foreclosure is that this isn't really a linear process for most people. They will be late on their mortgage, they'll get a threatening letter, they'll find a way to become current, they'll become late, then they'll become current, they'll get a notice of default, they might become current again, and then maybe they'll have a short sale on their home or transfer the deed. But this usually isn't a totally straightforward, simple process. And the timeline of this is really complicated by a number of factors, including forbearance agreements, meaning once an auction is scheduled, the borrowers can say, no, you're required to postpone this for a little while, especially as new regulations are being passed around homeowner protection. Borrowers can request to go to mediation with their lenders. They can request loan modifications, especially if they filed for bankruptcy. There are certain periods of rights of redemption. Even if you've lost your home, in some states you can have up to 6 months to get your home back. And so how long this whole process takes, exactly what path a homeowner takes, is really, really complicated. The stages have really different impacts on individuals, and they have really different impacts on communities. So there is some sense that a foreclosure auction should be considered a really good thing from the community perspective, because if folks have been are kind of underwater on their mortgage and they're in the foreclosure process that can last up to 400 days, maybe they've actually walked away from their home and nobody is responsible for that home. And when that auction finally happens and a bank takes possession, in some markets, that means that someone is actually going to go in, see what's going on with that home, maintain the property, and this can be a good thing. In other cases, if there's a real family living in that home and they're keeping up the property and they know their neighbors, they're maintaining the social ties, the auction and reverting to a boarded up, vacant home can be a really bad thing. So this is a really multifarious process, and it isn't straightforward. The other point I want to make about the foreclosure process is that this isn't random who underwent foreclosure as part of the housing crisis. So what I'm showing here is a chart comparing the rates of completed foreclosure per 10,000 loans for African American, Latino, and non-Hispanic white borrowers. And what you see is that the rate of foreclosure on loans is about double that of whites for African American and Latino borrowers during the lead up and peak of the housing crisis. The part of this is about discriminatory lending practices. Part of this is about going into sort of home ownership with lower levels of wealth that you might have to leverage yourself out more to enter into home ownership, depending on your initial financial situation. But there have been some analyses, particularly by Doug Massey and colleagues in the American Sociological Review, saying that segregation itself is an independent predictor of foreclosure. And the consequences, and the consequences of this also mean that when African American and Latino borrowers were foreclosed on, who were their neighbors more likely to be? African American and Latino neighbors. So the social spillover effects of foreclosure were even more highly concentrated in communities of color. Here's just another presentation of the racial ethnic disparities and who underwent foreclosure. And what this is showing in the first column on the left is the share of loans that were taken out by low income, moderate income, and middle income and high income borrowers of African American, Latino, non-Hispanic, white identification. And then the next column shows the share of foreclosures in that group that occurred in each population group, and then the disparities ratio. So, for example, low-income African Americans took out about 15% of loans among low-income borrowers, but they accounted for 21% of the completed foreclosures. And so the point I want to make here is that this isn't, high income didn't protect Black and Latino borrowers from racial ethnic disparities in likelihood of undergoing foreclosure. And so now so what do we know from the health perspective from those 40-odd studies about the effects of foreclosures? Well, I would say a little more than half of the studies have looked at the effect of you personally undergoing foreclosure, being at some point of the foreclosure process yourself. And what we see some evidence that being late on your mortgage payments is associated with depressive symptoms. Don Alley found this in the HRS. But others have found, no, there's no association with being late on your mortgage payment and depressive symptoms. There's evidence on that those late on their mortgage payments are likely at risk of medication non-adherence, a lower self-rated health, although evidence on this is mixed, lower overall well-being. Then there's a class of papers that looks at being somewhere in the foreclosure process. And so we don't really know whether that means you got a notice of a default, whether a foreclosure sale has been scheduled, whether this is your third time looping back and forth saying we're going to sell your home, we're going to sell your home, oh wait, you can become current, how long has this been going on? We have no idea. But again, we have some evidence on medication non-adherence, hypertension, renal disease. This evidence really comes from Craig Pollack's work. Psychiatric conditions, heart disease, null effects on general health in at least one study. And then the third sort of exposure people have looked at is the effect of actually losing your home in a foreclosure sale. And there is some evidence that depression, anxiety, and alcohol abuse, risk of these outcomes is increased when you lose your home in a foreclosure sale. This is work from Burgard in 2012, and that this is associated with increase in common mental illness, right? So, but again, the findings are mixed, and so when we talk about, is there an effect of foreclosure on individuals? I think the first question is, well, what do you mean by foreclosure? What stage of the foreclosure process? For whom and when? But this is an overview of the individual level evidence. And what I'm more interested in, and actually a little bit more detail I'm going to get into very quickly now, is about the effect of foreclosures on entire communities, right? So a lot of what we know about the effect of having foreclosed properties in your neighborhood actually comes from a certain type of foreclosure. These bank-owned, vacant foreclosures, we call them REOs in shorthand. And I've put up really conservative estimates from the real estate finance literature, from the urban planning literature, from the criminology literature, that basically has shown that when there are these vacant bank-owned properties in communities, it ends up costing municipalities a lot of money, either foregone taxes, costs to board up properties if banks don't do it properly, responding to police and fire calls, for example. We know that these real estate-owned properties, or REOs, are uniquely associated with 311 calls with neighbors complaining about the property. So Lauren Lambie Hansen has done some great work in Boston looking at 311 calls and saying, tracking properties over time and saying when properties are in the foreclosure pipeline, yes, they get some calls for nuisances, but it's really when they become real estate owned that the calls start to spike. And there's this unique association with 311 calls. And this can be anything from the pipes burst and it's flooding my yard, there's mold, there's pests, there's squatters, there's criminal activity. We know that there is a price depreciation effect. So if you live next door or very close to a foreclosed property, the evidence is really strong within 100 meters. Your home is actually going to be worth less. The estimates on this range. I'm giving a very conservative estimate, but other folks have said the price depreciation effect can be up to 10% of the total property value. And then there's a number of studies that have said when you have real estate owned, these vacant bank owned foreclosures on your block or at very small administrative units, people have measured this like at the block group level, for example, that you see an increase in violent crime. So for every REO on a block face in New York City, Ingrid Gould-Ellen had found a 2 to 3% increase in the violent crime rate that year and lower effects on nearby blocks, so a bit of a spatial decay. And I think just as importantly as sort of the scholarly literature on this, what we also started seeing during the housing crisis is actual people speaking up and saying this is terrible for us, right? So this is in Alameda County, there's a community-based organization, Just Causa Justa, and they had put out actually a report on the health impacts of foreclosure long before any of the researchers were writing about this. And what they said was, we are incredibly stressed out if this is happening to our neighbors, people we've known for 20 years being displaced. I don't know when this is going to happen to me. I'm afraid of doubling up. I'm getting pressure on me to have people double up in my home. This is terrible for our community. This is terrible for our health. And so, we see this in the academic literature. Those who are doing community-based work have known it longer than the research community. And the spatial distribution of these vacant foreclosed properties is also not random, right? So I'm just showing you some maps from Chicago, and on the far left what we have is a spatial distribution of vacant buildings, and the estimate is that about close to 90% of these vacant buildings are a direct result of a foreclosure that no one is now occupying, but about 10% of them are vacant for other reasons. And then you can just see the spatial overlays with poverty, drug violence locations, drug violations by ward. I could have put race or median household income up here too. And you see that the multiple geographic vulnerabilities begin to overlap. So what do we know as a research community on the health effects of being exposed to these community-level foreclosure processes? Well, you know, the evidence it can be a little bit confusing, right? So on one hand, Jason Houle and colleagues have found that it's the rate of REO filings that is predictive of depressive symptoms and mental health, but not rates of default that are associated with depressive symptoms and mental health. We've seen evidence that from Curie and Tekin that when you look at rates of completed foreclosures, whether they go REO or they're bought by third parties, in census tracts you see increases in non-elective hospital visits and ED encounters, although others have looked at this as well with different outcomes and have said that rates of foreclosure sales have nothing to do with weight gain, have nothing to do with glycemic control. For example, one of these papers is going to be coming out in AJE hopefully pretty soon. And then a whole range of papers kind of up at top, again, have used any foreclosure filing. So it's very unclear sort of why these things are grouped together to say, you know, is the foreclosure rate associated with population health in general? So Brooks Gunn looked at the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study and looked at child maltreatment. And we also had evidence, Wood 2012, looking at child maltreatment with all foreclosure filings, and they found conflicting results about child maltreatment. There's good evidence, well, there's consistent evidence on self-rated health and suicide, that foreclosure filings in an area increases suicide and decreases lower self-rated reports of self-rated health. The evidence on crime is mixed. And what I'm going to actually run through really quickly here is some of my work looking at the proximity to these real estate-owned properties specifically, because I think there's a particularly unique policy intervention point for those, and evidence of weight gain and blood pressure. And so I've looked at this in the Framingham Heart Study in Massachusetts, using data on all foreclosures, actually all real estate transactions that took place in the state of Massachusetts between 1987 and 2008. And the graph that I'm showing, the orange line on the graph, shows foreclosure rates in Massachusetts over time. And so the study period I'm talking about actually contained two housing crises, the start of the Great Recession and a housing crisis that happened in Massachusetts in the early 90s that wasn't nationwide. What my co-authors and I did was geocode all of the real estate transaction files for Massachusetts for this period, filtered out where there were foreclosure sales, where that foreclosure actually was reverted to bank ownership, and then tracked that property until it was taken out of REO status, and so until it was sold to a third-party buyer. So instead of having, like every other study I showed you, rates of foreclosure filings over a certain geography, over a certain time period, what we did is we actually said there is a foreclosed property at this address, and it's been bank-owned for 400 days or 600 days, and we're going to count that even though the filing didn't happen in this year. And we're going to be looking at the foreclosure inventory, the glut of REOs, rather than kind of the incidence of how often are the filings on these properties happening. And then we geocoded all the Framingham Heart Study participants and used the exact date of their exam, all of their exams between 1987 and 2008. and their exact geographic address. And this was really complicated to get permission to link Federal Reserve Bank data with FHS, but eventually we did it. And dropped a pin on the map and said, okay, so in the 12 months leading up to, so let's say Ichiro Kawachi goes in for his exam for FHS on April 1st in 2007. We're going to count back exactly 12 months from Ichiro's specific exam when his blood pressure was measured, when his weight was measured, and we're going to say how many of these REOs were present for some portion of that 12-month period specific to Ichiro and specific to Ichiro's address. We're going to count them up, and we're going to count them up for different buffer sizes. And then we're going to look at whether these are predictive of some of the measured health outcomes. So the first one we looked at was actually changes in body mass index. And I'm not going to explain the difference between these models except to say that once we controlled for the neighborhood factors, controlling for some of the individual factors were completely uncorrelated with what we were interested in. But the take-home message here is that living within 100 meters of a bank-owned foreclosed property in the year leading up to your Framingham Heart Study exam was associated with weight gain, 0.2 unit increase in BMI. And we then exploited the fact that the timeline of when do these REOs actually get created is actually very random, depending on how many times you can become current, depending on how long your bank wants to give you on a forbearance agreement, depending on whether you were able to negotiate a loan modification. So for example, if we counted foreclosures in the April 1st example with Ichiro, if there was a foreclosure that became REO in February, our argument was, it's sort of random that foreclosure didn't become REO on April 15th, right? That actually when you have a timeline of a 400, 500-day foreclosure timeline, and some of these foreclosure REOs are bank-owned for years, right? The exact timing of the date with respect to the exact timing of the Framingham Heart Study exam, which is also a random day within a 4 to 6 month period, we should be able to exploit that variability to get at, is it really a local foreclosure that is causing this health effect, or is it some kind of underlying trend that we can't detect? And so what we did is we looked at what happens if we look at the foreclosures that were present in the 3 years before the exam, and you see we're still marginally significant, smaller effect size, 0.1 unit BMI change. When you go 5 years out, we're no longer statistically significant. The effect estimate is lower. And then I think for me, the most sort of reassuring finding is that when we look 12 months in the future, right, again, so we see absolutely no association with what is going to happen in terms of the localized foreclosure activity and measured weight when we look 12 months in the future. And we would think that if this was really detecting some kind of underlying microenvironmental trend that was really reflecting spurious associations, that this 12 months in the future would look very, very similar to the 12 months in the past, and that's not what we see. Skip over this. Then it kind of occurred to us to say, let's look at blood pressure. So what I'm showing you is the effect of having an REO property, each REO property within 100 meters, which in this sample, I went and got the zoning data for about 92% of the neighborhoods it was available. 100 meters in this sample really means the house, 1 or 2 houses to your left, 1 or 2 houses to your right, the house in front of you that you see, and the house behind you. And what we see is that for every REO in that very micro neighborhood, we see an increase of 1.7 millimeters of mercury in systolic blood pressure, and this is partially mediated by alcohol consumption, increased alcohol consumption, and weight gain. And then we use this data to create a typology for it. Now that we have seen that it is REOs, I'm not presenting evidence where we looked at other types of foreclosures and said, well, what happens when the foreclosure sells at the auction? It goes to the third-party sale. And when that happens, no effects on health, right? Is when there is a foreclosure sale, it reverts to bank ownership, and it sits there. That's when we see the effect. So we used this to write a policy piece for the Fed that was looking for ideas of where do we focus on in this housing recovery, and we said, let's look at foreclosed bank-owned properties that are sitting in neighborhoods, and let's not just think about where there is an economic benefit to how to reuse them, but a social benefit. So we created a typology that took into account communities that had a lack of affordable housing, especially near transit, and said, given our housing crisis, it's unconscionable that we have hundreds of government-owned Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, hundreds of government-owned housing units in communities that lack affordable housing and that have transit access into Boston, right? So this is just an example of a framework for how to take that research question and say, what do we do for it with policy? So I guess I'm going to actually end here and not go into some of the broader policy implications, but to say that when people say, what's the effect of foreclosure on health, it is messy. It's a little bit messy, and part of that is because we need a better theory-driven approach to defining exposure. And I would urge everyone to take the time and read the Financial Crisis Inquiry Report on how this happened. I think actually coming off of this day and a half where we've been hearing so much about poverty, job insecurity, neighborhood effects, economic opportunity, it is really telling to read. It's a 600-page report, but it's a really telling report. And the authors of the report said, we conclude this financial crisis was avoidable. The crisis was the result of human action and inaction, not of Mother Nature or computer models gone haywire. We conclude widespread failures in financial regulation and supervision proved devastating to the stability of the nation's financial market. And there was a systemic breakdown in accountability and ethics. But at the same time, the breadth of the crisis does not mean that everyone is at fault. The centuries were not at their posts, in no small part due to the widely accepted faith in the self-correcting nature of the markets and the ability of financial institutions to effectively police themselves. More than 30 years of deregulation and reliance on self-regulation by financial institutions, championed by the former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan and others, supported by successive administrations and Congress, actively pushed by powerful financial industry at every turn, had stripped away key safeguards which could have helped avoid catastrophe. And the greatest tragedy to come out of this crisis would be to accept the refrain that no one could have seen this coming and nothing could have been done. And if we accept this notion, it will happen again. And I think, so I just want to end on that note in terms of trying to tie together some of the themes that we've heard. I think we as researchers, to draw on Nancy's eco-social theory, need to be keeping accountability and agency at the focus of our work. And all these economic exposures are tied together. So thanks for your attention.
That was a fantastic note to have our last speaker. I know we're a bit over time, but maybe some people like to ask a couple of questions and to any of the three panelists, because we promised that's what we do. Please come up to the mic and introduce yourself, say who you are and to whom your question is addressed.
Hi. Is this on? My name is Anna Leslie. I work here in Boston, and I'd actually love to hear more about the policy implications. I've not been in this realm for a few years, so, but thinking about the 311 calls, for example, I think all of the data that we do have at our disposal, and looking at, yes, there's federal policy implications, but so much of this happens at the local and state level, and so many of those institutions do not talk to each other. And I work with a family with a mom who her landlord removed the toilet from their house and did not replace it, and so they had a hole in their floor for 6 weeks. Black mold growing, they had to leave in February and were placed in state-sponsored shelter, which was a hotel room where they've been living for 8 months. So that's a failure of those systems communicating, landlords not being held accountable, of the city inspectional services, of the state. So how is this informing that? Because Boston is, if not the most, one of the most income unequal cities in the country. And this could be, and hopefully is informing that, so I'd love to hear how that's happening.
Yeah, so one of the points I didn't get a chance to make was I think that one of the key research needs here is to better understand the relationship between foreclosure and gentrification, both from the policy perspective in terms of, we have some evidence on neighborhoods that neighborhoods with high foreclosure rates saw more rapid and larger magnitude changes in racial composition and income, average income in the neighborhood. And so we know that foreclosure can be something that actually spurs neighborhood change, and are those neighborhoods then more at risk for gentrification processes? But from the individual level, we don't have a good sense of, is the family that barely made it into home ownership and then lost everything in the foreclosure crisis and is now renting in a low-income neighborhood, the same family that's getting pushed out from rising rents and gentrification? Or is the same low-income renter family that was evicted because their landlord was underwater in their mortgage and was foreclosed on in the foreclosure crisis now the same family that's being evicted for because an investor is willing to pay a lot to rehab the property and make it a luxury apartment? So there's work going on in Boston. The Right to Remain Coalition is doing a lot of this work. I'm interested in answering this question. I have a mixed method study going on with the Conservation Law Foundation on neighborhood change and health, and we're actually surveying about 500 residents in 9 low-income communities around Metro Boston, and we're actually asking these questions of, why are you here? Were you forced out of your old neighborhood? Have you always been here? Was it foreclosure? Was it gentrification? Do you think you're going to be able to stay here? If not, why not? And trying to get at some of these questions. But I think that you're right. I think that we have to be having inspectional services, fair housing folks. We have to have the Fed, community development corporations all in touch about what's going on, because these are all the same neighborhoods.
Mariana, stay right there. I just have a quick question for you. Thank you for your really excellent presentation. So I'm thinking about how we can link some of the different concepts that we've heard about in terms of institutional racism and gender inequality, and if you found any differential effects in your study related to racial ethnic composition. And also I'm thinking about structure of the households around whether female-headed, male-headed, or what also the age composition might be.
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I'm really glad you asked it, because it allows me to note a limitation in the papers, the analysis that I presented on Framingham, which is that the cohort was not diverse enough for us to do that. And so the equity, a lot of what we know about the implications of foreclosure some of them have been, cross-sectional analyses using BRFSS, and then you can look at some of this stuff. But the, more detailed, trying to make a better causal identification of what's going on here has not been from diverse samples at all. And so what we know is that families of color and communities of color have been harder hit, but a lot of the estimates of what's the effect on health have actually come from mostly white participants, and that's a real problem. There's some work from Detroit. Allison Aiello's group is, I think, making a dent in this, and I don't know if Libby's still here, but unfortunately my papers did not with Framingham.
Thank you very much. I think we can continue the conversation outside at lunch. There's some bagged sandwiches for you to walk away with. Okay, as you leave, please don't forget to hand in your evaluation forms for the meeting. I think that you can deposit them in a box by the front desk. I'd like to thank again the closing panelists for a really stimulating session. Thank you. And I don't see Circe and Yenny are not here. I guess they're outside manning the desks, but Circe Lecomte and Yenny So were the two students who effectively put together the show. So please give them a big hand of appreciation in their absence. And thank you for your attendance. We'll see you next year.